Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The job seemed like a dream at first. After my first year of college, I was looking for something that would pay well over the summer. This job as a watchman seemed perfect. It was a bit remote, overlooking the Mississippi River, but it offered a hefty paycheck. The hours were long, but I didn't mind. I had no real social life at the time, so the isolation sounded like a good fit. The conditions, however, would soon turn out to be more than I had bargained for. The office was small, perched on a little hill, barely visible from the surrounding woods. To get to it, I had to walk a few hundred feet through the trees, which was always a little eerie, especially since I worked the 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. By the time I got to work, it was already dark, and by the time I left, it was dark again. The walk to the office felt longer with each passing night, the trees whispering in the wind, the soft scurrying of animals unseen in the underbrush. Sometimes, I would hear a rustling that would make me pause, holding my breath, but it was never anything more than the wind or a critter. The setup was simple enough. I was in charge of watching a radar screen to make sure that none of the floating equipment tied up along the bank of the river drifted away or got stolen. There were barges, cranes, and various other pieces of machinery, all of them anchored to the bank. I had to make sure nothing went missing or sank into the water. It sounded easy enough, and it would have been if not for the isolation. I was the only one there at night. The only sounds were the hum of the radar machine, the occasional rustling from outside, and the low murmur of the river below. It was also a little unnerving because the previous 2 watchmen had quit within a week. They had warned me about the place, saying it was too creepy and remote, and that they just couldn't handle the solitude. The first guy had left because he was tired of the endless quiet and the occasional weird sounds he'd hear at night. The second guy couldn't deal with the isolation and strange occurrences he felt were happening around him. Things like lights flickering and the sense that something was always watching him. They didn't seem to have specific complaints, just that it was too weird. Still, the job paid well, and I was willing to take the risk. The company didn't provide a firearm, but they told me I could carry one if I wanted to. I didn't own a gun, and honestly, I didn't feel like I needed one. That was a big red flag in hindsight, but at the time, it didn't bother me too much. The work was easy, the pay was good, and I liked the solitude. I didn't sleep more than 4 to 5 hours a night anyway, so staying awake for the long shifts was never an issue. My routine was simple. Every couple of hours, I'd take a flashlight and walk along the banks of the river to inspect the equipment. It wasn't anything intense, just a quick check to make sure everything was in place. Most of the time, everything was fine. I'd look over the radar, glance out at the river to make sure nothing was drifting away, then get back to my chair, leaning back and letting the quiet fill the room. But one night, something caught my eye on the radar. A small crane barge, not far from the others, was moving. It wasn't drifting fast, but it was certainly drifting. The ropes holding it in place didn't look tight, and with the current, it could easily float away if a passing boat created any waves. It was an easy fix, I thought. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out into the night, determined to tie the barge off more securely. When I reached the crane barge, I could see that it was already swaying gently, tugging at the ropes. I wasn't much of a deckhand. I wasn't trained in handling this kind of stuff, but I figured I could pull it in a little tighter. I grabbed the nearest rope, yanked hard, but nothing moved. The current was stronger than I anticipated, and the barge was locked in place by more than just a few loose ropes. In a moment of stupidity, I decided to board the crane barge. Maybe it was the adrenaline of the night shift or the need to get the job done. But whatever it was, I thought I saw a rope on the crane I could use to pull the barge in further. I thought I could just hop onto the barge, tighten the rope, and everything would be fine. That was when I made my biggest mistake. As soon as I stepped onto the barge, I felt it shift beneath my feet. I heard the sound of ropes snapping and water sloshing around the hull. I looked around in horror, realizing that the crane barge was coming loose. The current was much stronger than I thought, and the barge had no anchor anymore. I tried to jump back onto the shore, but it was too late. I had no choice now but to ride it out. There I was, standing in the dark on a breakaway barge, floating down the Mississippi River, without a life jacket, without a radio, and barely any hope of survival. The river seemed to stretch on forever, and I was powerless to stop it. I had no way to signal anyone, no way to get back to shore. The only thing I could do was hang on and pray I didn't hit anything that would sink me. The minutes felt like hours as the barge floated aimlessly in the dark. There was no one around. The river was wide and empty, with very little traffic at that hour. The boaters I did see were too far away to notice my flashlight as I tried to signal them. My flashlight beam bounced off the water, the light reflecting off the dark waves as I watched the dark land recede in the distance. The water was cold, the air crisp. I shivered, the fear tightening in my chest. I realized then that I could drown if I wasn't careful. I could hit something in the dark, a submerged log, another barge, anything, and go under. The river could swallow me whole, and no one would even know until morning. I felt the edges of panic creeping in as the sound of the water rushed louder and louder in my ears. And then I hit something. A bridge. It was only a light scrape at first, but the barge lurched sideways, and I was thrown off balance. For a moment, I lost my footing, and it felt like the barge might tip over. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scrambled to hold on to anything that would keep me on board. The crash had shoved the barge closer to another massive barge, one that was moored securely to the bank. I grabbed the nearest crane boom, my hands slipping on the cold metal, but I managed to climb it, slowly and cautiously. By the time I reached the top, the barge had wedged itself between the bridge and the larger barge. I was stuck, but at least I was safe, and I had no immediate threat of sinking. I waited. The river churned below me, dark and relentless, but I was no longer floating away. My flashlight lay useless at the bottom of the barge, its beam flickering out. The only sound now was the occasional creak of the metal and the soft, steady rush of the river. As the hours dragged on, I began to realize just how much trouble I was in. There was no way I could get off the barge by myself. I had no tools, no equipment, and no way to reach anyone. I just had to wait until someone found me. By dawn, the river had begun to settle, and the light of the rising sun made the entire scene seem almost surreal. I sat on the deck of the barge, my mind racing, my body aching. Mosquitoes had already begun to feast on my exposed skin, leaving hundreds of red, itchy welts all over me. I was covered in bites, my clothes damp from the night's ordeal, and my heart still racing with adrenaline. Then, a boat appeared on the horizon, a small tugboat making its way downriver. The captain saw me, probably because I was the only thing on the water in that stretch, and he stopped to pick me up. He was as surprised to see me as I was to be found. I was shaken, exhausted, and still reeling from the close call. The tugboat crew helped me climb aboard, offering me a blanket and a bottle of water. They asked if I was okay, but there was nothing to say. I had survived. The barge was still where it should be, no damage done to any of the equipment. I had managed to hold on long enough to avoid disaster. As we made our way back to shore, I could barely keep my eyes open. The whole night felt like a nightmare. I was exhausted, my body sore, and the buzzing in my head wouldn't stop. The river had taken me on a journey I would never forget. I was alive, but just barely. When we reached the shore, the crew helped me off the tugboat. I walked back to my office, a little slower than usual, still trying to process what had just happened. My job was simple, and it paid well, but I had never expected something like this. The company didn't ask any questions when I explained what happened, and after that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back. The equipment was fine. Nothing had been damaged. But I was done. I didn't care how much they paid me. I wasn't coming back. I worked the graveyard shift at a convenience store. It's a lonely, eerie time to be at work, especially when you're the only one in the store, surrounded by shelves that never seem to be fully stocked, dim lighting that always feels a little too cold, and the endless hum of the fridge and freezers. It's not much, but it's a job. I've been doing this for a while now, filling in for other stores when they're short-staffed or just need an extra hand. Tonight was no different, though I had a feeling things were about to take a strange turn. It was around 2 a.m. when she walked in. She didn't make a sound. The store has this loud alarm that rings when the door opens, but there wasn't a peep. I was in the middle of stocking the shelves, barely paying attention to anything outside the usual routine. I'd been in and out of the aisles, moving things around to keep the place looking busy, when I heard a soft voice from behind me. "Can I get some chips?" she asked. I turned to look at her, slightly surprised at how quietly she had entered. She stood at the counter, holding a small, unassuming bag of chips. Her face was worn, but not in an overtly bad way. She looked a little frazzled, like she hadn't slept in a while, but she wasn't dirty or acting strangely. At least, not at first. "Sure," I said, walking over to ring her up. "Anything else?" "No, just the chips," she replied, and then she suddenly started talking, her voice a little shaky but strangely calm. She started talking about the coronavirus, rambling on about the chaos it was causing. At first, I thought it was just the usual late-night ramblings. People talk about strange things when they've been awake too long, and I was used to it. But then she said something that made me pause, something that didn't seem to fit the conversation. "I ate an evil spirit, pretending to be a clove of garlic," she said, pulling a small piece of garlic from her bag and placing it gently on the counter. I blinked, trying to process what she had just said. Was she joking? Messing with me? I didn't know, but she wasn't laughing. She was dead serious, staring intently at the garlic like it was the most important thing in the world. I don't follow," I said, trying to stay polite. No, it's true," she insisted. "It's a demon trapped inside the garlic. It tried to possess me. It wanted to take over." I froze for a second. This wasn't normal. I'd seen my fair share of weird, but this felt different. She wasn't just acting off. She was speaking with a conviction that made me uncomfortable. She looked at me then, her eyes widening, as if she was revealing something that was supposed to stay secret. "You're one of us," she said. "You're not just a human. You're a third demon. But you're also a third angel, sent to help me deal with these spirits, these evil forces." I had no idea how to respond to that. It felt like she was talking in riddles, but her gaze didn't waver. She was serious, so serious that it made my skin crawl. I was just trying to get through the shift, but here she was dragging me into whatever madness was in her mind. I didn't believe in any of it, of course. Demons, angels, spirits, none of it. It was just a woman who probably needed help. I figured maybe she was going through something. Maybe she was just having a breakdown or dealing with some kind of personal crisis. Either way, I needed to keep things calm. "I'm just a guy working the night shift," I said, trying to bring her back to reality. "Are you sure you're okay? I mean, it's late. Maybe you should get some rest." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she leaned in closer, looking at the garlic on the counter like it was about to speak. "You'll see it," she said. "You can see it if you look. It's there. The evil. But you can help. You're a third angel. You just don't know it yet." I didn't know what else to say. What do you say to someone who thinks they're talking to angels and demons in the middle of a convenience store at 2 a.m.? She placed the garlic on the counter and said, "I'll wait. You deal with it. You'll help me. I'll be right here." And with that, she just stood there, staring at me, waiting. I didn't know how to respond, so I nodded and backed away slowly. She grabbed her chips, paid for them, and walked out like nothing had happened. The whole interaction left me feeling on edge, like I was waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I locked the door behind her and went back to my tasks, trying to push the weird encounter from my mind. But that wasn't the last time I saw her. A few nights later, I was working the same shift. It was about 2 a.m. again when I saw her. This time, she just walked in like it was any other night. She didn't say anything at first. Just walked up to the counter, picking up a couple of pieces of candy and casually placing them on the counter like she'd done 1,000 times. I rang up her items, still trying to process the strange interaction from the other night. She was acting normal now, almost too normal, like the bizarre conversation had never happened. I asked her, "Do we know each other? You seem familiar." She paused, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Have we met before?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as if she was trying to place me too. I don't know," I replied, though I was sure I had never seen her before the other night. Then she asked if we carried jade jewelry, which I thought was a weird shift in topic, but I answered her anyway. She seemed to be fine, just a little talkative and curious about things. But something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but something in my gut kept telling me to stay alert. She left the counter, walking off toward the aisle with incense and crystals, and I went back to stocking shelves. But this time, I didn't hear her leave. The store has a very loud alarm that rings when the door opens. Everyone in the store can hear it. But this time, I didn't hear anything. No bell, no chime, nothing. I walked to the front to check, and I saw her standing at the restroom door. She gave me a brief wave as she walked in, but something felt off. I had been stocking shelves for the last hour, and no one had entered or left the store during that time. So how had she gotten in without me hearing the door? I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the alarm malfunctioned, or maybe I was just tired. But then time started to pass. I cleaned up the counter, tidied the aisles, and even checked my phone for a few minutes. I was still waiting for her to come out of the restroom, but something didn't sit right. She stayed in there for an hour, then another hour. I started to worry. She hadn't been in the restroom for that long before. Had she? Maybe I should check on her, but I didn't want to overstep. I walked over and knocked on the restroom door. No answer. I hesitated, but then decided to just check the stalls. No one was in there. I even looked at the ceiling, thinking maybe she had managed to somehow hide up there. But no, nothing. There was no way she could have slipped out. The room was small, no windows, no other exits. I checked again, looked under the stalls. Nothing. Yet, when I walked back into the main area, she was gone. Just like that, she vanished without a trace. No sound of the door opening, no sign of her leaving. She wasn't there anymore. I stood there for a while, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it. She couldn't have gone anywhere, not without me hearing her. But somehow, she managed to disappear into thin air. A couple of hours later, she reappeared, walking out from the back with a nonchalant wave, acting as if nothing had happened. I couldn't bring myself to say anything to her. It was all too bizarre, too unsettling. She walked out of the store like she had every right to be there, as if we were just two strangers passing in the night. But I knew something wasn't right. Something about her, about the way she appeared and disappeared, didn't make sense. I didn't see her after that night. It's been weeks, and I haven't had another weird encounter with her. But I can't shake the feeling that she's out there, somewhere, waiting for something, or maybe waiting for me to figure something out. I don't know what it was, but it's left me on edge every night since. I just hope I never see her again, because no matter how strange it all seemed, I knew something wasn't right. Something was off, and I don't know if I'm ready to find out what it was. I was 13, and every summer I practically lived at my best friend Emily's house. We were inseparable, like two halves of the same whole. She lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood on the edge of a small town, an exurb really, where houses were spread out enough that it felt like country living, but not so far out that you couldn't walk to the nearest store or get a ride into town. Still, there was something oddly peaceful about the area. It wasn't like a bustling neighborhood, but more like a stretch of homes surrounded by fields and woods, with long, empty stretches of road connecting everything. During the summer, Emily and I would often sneak out at night. We weren't supposed to be out that late, of course, but our parents were used to us being at each other's houses by then. They probably figured we'd be on the phone or playing video games or something, but we didn't need screens to entertain ourselves. We preferred the darkness, the quiet of the night when everything was still. There was something thrilling about the world outside at night. It felt like everything was ours to explore, at least for a few hours before we had to go back inside and pretend we had been sleeping. Most of the time, we'd just roam around the streets around her house. We'd talk about random things, what we were going to do when we got older, how we thought the world worked, our secret plans for everything. We weren't scared of anything. Emily's house was surrounded by fields, and those fields were bordered by woods. It was the kind of place that was isolated, but safe. If you looked out from her backyard at night, the fields stretched out to the horizon, lit only by the distant lights of other houses and the stars above. It was peaceful, but one night, things felt different. Emily and I decided to wander a bit farther out. We didn't have a particular destination in mind, but there was a road we hadn't walked down before, and we figured we might as well check it out. It was a narrow road that ran through a field, a long stretch of dirt and gravel that went on for a while. It looked kind of like it was meant to lead somewhere, but the houses were far enough away that it felt empty, like we were walking through a forgotten part of the neighborhood. As we made our way down the road, we talked about silly things, mostly just chatting and laughing, as we usually did. It wasn't cold, but there was a strange breeze, one that made the grass along the sides of the road sway in an odd way, like it was moving to its own rhythm. It wasn't a bad feeling, just different from the usual stillness. After a while, the road ended at a cul-de-sac. There, behind a tall iron gate, was a dirt driveway leading into what seemed like a large property. The gate was old and rusty, standing there like it hadn't been opened in years. There was a feeling of neglect about the place, but it didn't seem like anyone lived there. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and you couldn't see much beyond the gate. It was like a dead end, a forgotten part of the world that no one cared to visit. We didn't think much of it at first. It was just another stop on our nighttime adventure. But as we stood there, staring at the gate and the dark driveway beyond it, something changed. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like the air itself got heavier. The wind stopped, the grass didn't move, and for a second, everything felt wrong. I looked at Emily, and I could see it in her face. She was feeling it too. The kind of fear that creeps up on you when you realize something isn't right, even if you can't put your finger on what exactly is wrong. We both just stopped talking. Our laughter stopped in an instant, and the silence between us grew. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like the world had paused for just a second, and in that pause, a sense of dread filled the space between us. The air was thick, heavy with something unexplainable. It wasn't just fear, it was an overwhelming sense of something being wrong. Something was there, watching, waiting. I don't know how long we stood there, but in that moment, the unease crept over both of us at the exact same time. I felt it in my gut, like a cold, sinking feeling. My heart started to race. I could tell Emily was scared too, because she was staring at the gate the way I was, her eyes wide, like she had just realized what I had realized. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. We both knew something was off. I remember my legs felt weak. The air seemed to thicken, like it was hard to breathe. We stood there for a moment longer, frozen. The gate loomed in front of us, casting a shadow over the road like it was holding something back. Something we couldn't see but both knew was there. It felt like the night had turned against us. Then, as if some invisible force had pushed us, we both turned around at the same time. Without saying a word, we started running. We didn't look back, not once. I didn't even know if Emily was right behind me or not. My only focus was getting away, as fast as I could. My feet pounded against the gravel, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Every step felt like it was taking me further from whatever it was that had made us so scared. I don't know how far we ran, but by the time we reached the edge of the road, near the first houses again, the feeling started to fade. The air wasn't as thick. The wind picked up again, and everything seemed normal once more. But the panic was still in my chest. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and my legs were shaking. Emily was still beside me, but we didn't say anything. We didn't need to. The fear was still hanging in the air, but it was different now. It was fading, slipping back into the darkness where it belonged. We didn't talk about it when we got back to her house. We just sat in her room, too wired to sleep. The silence between us was full of the same fear we had felt back at the cul-de-sac, but now it was more of a shared understanding. We both knew that something had happened, something we couldn't explain. We hadn't seen anything, heard anything, or even felt anything specific, but there had been a presence. Something we both had felt at the exact same moment. It wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, we didn't even mention it. The sun was up, and everything seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That road, that gate, they were still there, just down the way like they had always been. But I couldn't forget the way everything had felt when we had been there, the heaviness, the cold dread. It felt like we had stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see, something we weren't supposed to find. We didn't go back to that road. We didn't need to. The fear of that night stayed with us, even without words. I don't know what it was, what we felt, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that we narrowly avoided something bad. Maybe it was just the atmosphere of the place, the isolation, the overgrown weeds, the rusted gate. Maybe it was something in the air, a sense of danger we couldn't explain. But whatever it was, I'm glad we left when we did. I still don't know what we felt that night. I don't know if we were just spooked, or if there was something real in that field, something waiting behind that gate. All I know is that Emily and I both felt it at the same time. That kind of fear doesn't just come from nowhere. Maybe we did avoid something terrible. Maybe we never will know what was out there, but that's okay. Some things are better left unknown. I was 18, feeling pretty good about the whole solo road trip thing. I had decided to take my time driving up to Salt Lake to see my family. The original plan was to make it a straightforward 11-hour drive, but being on my own meant I could stop wherever I wanted, take in the views, stretch my legs, and just enjoy the ride. I didn't have much money, so spending on a hotel was out of the question. Instead, I figured I'd find a secluded spot in the desert to camp for the night. Not much of a risk, I thought. After all, I wasn't going to be on anyone's land that would really care. I was about an hour past the racetrack, just outside Las Vegas. The stretch of highway was pretty isolated, and there wasn't much around except for empty desert, farm roads leading off the freeway, and the occasional dirt track disappearing into the horizon. I felt like I had the entire world to myself. I took the exit, following a long, dusty road that led off into the desert. There wasn't a lot of traffic, so I didn't expect anyone to mind me being out here. It was the kind of place where if you wanted to be left alone, you could be. I found a small dirt clearing, parked my car, and opened up the tailgate. It was one of those cooler desert nights where the air is still warm, but not unbearable. The sky was wide and clear, the stars shining like diamonds scattered across velvet. I didn't have a tent, just the car for shelter, and that was good enough for me. I pulled out a bag of beef jerky and cracked open a can of Arizona tea, sitting back against the car, and settled in to eat. I was listening to music, my playlist looping songs I knew by heart, and I felt this rare kind of peace being out here in the quiet of nowhere. It was just me, the stars, and the open road. No deadlines, no people to deal with, just the vast, empty desert. Out of nowhere, I heard the roar of a motorcycle engine. The sound came out of nowhere, and I jumped, turning just in time to see a motorcycle zip past me at ridiculous speed. No lights, no nothing. I don't know why I found it so surprising, but it rattled me for a second. It was dark, almost midnight, and the guy was flying down the road like it was a racetrack, engine revving loud in the still night air. It was one of those moments where you couldn't help but laugh. I shook my head, thinking how dumb it was, but also how bold. I wasn't going to judge. It was their life. Let them do what they wanted. But still, it was weird. You don't see many people just tearing down empty roads like that. I figured he'd either gotten a wild idea or had just had enough of the normal world. I was still chuckling to myself when the sound of jets cut through the air, their engines like thunder in the night sky. 2 jets, low-flying, curving through the mountains like something out of a Top Gun movie. I watched as they cut across the dark sky, weaving between the mountain ridges. It was an amazing sight, honestly, the way they sliced through the air, and it kept me distracted for a while. If it weren't for the jets, I might have just dismissed the motorcycle as some guy with a death wish. But the jets made everything feel off, like I was in the middle of some random military exercise. A few minutes later, my peaceful night was interrupted by the sound of a convoy. The noise of engines slowly grew louder, the deep rumble of something bigger than the motorcycle or the jets. I couldn't see anything yet, but the sound of tires grinding against dirt and pavement sent a chill through me. Convoys I knew were military, and I grew up around them. It wasn't unusual to see them on the highways near Vegas, especially with the Air Force Base close by. But there was something different this time. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the strange series of events, but I had a gut feeling this wasn't just another convoy passing through. I kept watching, trying to figure out what was going on. The convoy finally appeared in the distance, a string of military vehicles lighting up the road. The headlights were blinding at first, and the sound of their engines rattled my car. As the convoy drew closer, I could hear the tires crunching the gravel and dirt beneath them. It was moving at a steady pace, but something about it felt deliberate. I wasn't sure why, but I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Normally, if you saw a convoy like this, you'd wave at them, maybe give a friendly nod, and let them pass. But this time, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was getting late, and I had no desire to deal with anything out here that might go beyond a simple wave. I stood up from the tailgate, stretched, and just watched the convoy. I tried to keep my distance, hoping they'd just pass by without causing any trouble. But then, a Hummer pulled up and slowed to a stop right in front of me, blocking the road. The vehicle was close enough that I could see the dark, military-grade paint job, the hum of the engine filling the air. I didn't move. I didn't even turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, hands resting on the car's hood, trying not to look like I was nervous. I could hear the doors open on the Hummer, but no one got out. It was like they were waiting for something. I kept my posture relaxed, not wanting to give them any reason to feel like I was a threat or a curiosity. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Just sitting there, minding my business. The lights from the convoy illuminated everything around me, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert floor. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides, the only sound being the low hum of the engines and the occasional metallic clink of equipment shifting. Minutes passed, and no one came over. No one spoke to me. It was like they were observing me, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. The rest of the convoy continued down the road, and after what felt like an eternity, the Hummer finally shifted, pulling away to follow the convoy. The headlights disappeared into the distance. The sound of engines faded, and I was left alone once more. My heart was still racing. I didn't know if it was just the weird chain of events or something else, but I felt off. I didn't want to hang around to find out what else might be lurking in the dark. Maybe it was my military upbringing kicking in, making me more aware of the unusual movements of the convoy. Maybe it was just my gut telling me that tonight wasn't like other nights. I got back into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. The peaceful solitude I had earlier was gone, replaced by a strange tension. I wasn't sure why I had that uneasy feeling. Maybe I was overthinking it, but something about that convoy, the way it moved, the way it just seemed to stop right in front of me, made me uneasy. I sat there for a while longer, debating whether I should just pack up and leave. But I was too tired. The drive had been long, and the whole experience had drained me. So I turned the car around, carefully drove away from the spot, and kept heading down the road, hoping to put it all behind me. As I made my way further down the highway, the weight on my chest lifted, but I couldn't shake the thought of the convoy, the jets, and the motorcycle. Everything about that night had been strange, but nothing overtly dangerous had happened. No one had approached me. The convoy just passed through. The motorcycle rider was long gone. It was just one of those nights, I thought, where the series of random events lined up in a way that made things feel a little off. I figured I'd get back to my family the next day, and it'd all be just a weird story to tell. Nothing more. Just a series of coincidences. And maybe, in the end, that was all it was. But there was still something in the back of my mind. Maybe it was just the way the hum of the engines lingered in the silence of the desert, or the way those jets had sliced through the night air like a warning. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd just stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I've been driving out to the country for band practice for a while now, about 40 minutes one way. It's the kind of drive that starts off okay, but the further I get out, the more the road twists and turns, and the more isolated it feels. By the time I head back home around 1 or 2 in the morning, the place I practice at is surrounded by nothing but woods and farmland. There are no other cars on the road at that time, which makes it feel like I'm the only person out there. Most of the time, it's a peaceful drive. I've gotten used to the dark roads, the occasional deer grazing along the sides of the highway, and the endless stretches of empty fields that seem to go on forever. The town I drive from isn't exactly a city, but it's not as remote as where the band practice happens. The only thing that makes this drive feel a little eerie is the silence. It's so quiet. Sometimes I feel like I'm the last person left on Earth. It's a fairly uneventful drive, to be honest. I've made it hundreds of times. The road itself is narrow, twisting through woods that get dense, with trees that look almost like they're closing in on you. You pass the occasional farmhouse, but they're few and far between. There are no streetlights out there, so the only light you get is from your headlights cutting through the darkness. I don't know why, but something about the late-night drive always makes me hyper-aware. I keep the radio low and my eyes scanning the road, just in case a deer decides to dart out of the woods like they love to do. It was a Saturday night, the usual practice session, and I was heading home like I always do. The music was still buzzing in my head from the jam session, and I was feeling a bit tired, but not overly so. It was a clear night, the kind of night where the sky felt impossibly dark, and the stars stood out like pinpricks in a black sheet. Everything around me felt still, too still. The air was cool, and there was a slight breeze rustling through the trees. The trees, tall and ancient-looking, seemed to bend and sway, but I knew there was nothing really out there. As I drove through a particularly dense stretch of trees, I started to feel that weird prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're pretty sure you're being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. I told myself I'd only feel it more if I kept dwelling on it, so I focused on the road ahead. But then, right at the edge of my headlights, I saw them, two bright, reflective eyes staring at me from the tree line. I slowed down instinctively, my foot easing off the gas. I didn't want to risk hitting a deer, especially when it was so late, and I was already tired. I've seen my fair share of deer crossing the road at night. They can be unpredictable and dangerous if you're not careful. The eyes gleamed in the dark, and I thought, all right, just a deer. Nothing to worry about. But something felt off. The eyes were a little too high, too far off the ground. I paused for a second, staring, trying to make out the shape of whatever was standing there. The eyes blinked once, but the creature didn't move. I could see a faint shape, but nothing too defined. It was just a shadow, really blending in with the trees behind it. But as I got closer, the shape seemed to shift. At least that's what it looked like. It wasn't standing still anymore. The thing on the edge of the woods started moving. I slowed even further, my foot barely on the brake. It was moving with a strange fluidity, like it wasn't just walking. It was more like it was gliding, quick, but deliberate. It moved sideways, darting across the tree line, like it was trying to stay hidden. My heart rate picked up. Whatever it wasn't acting like a deer. No deer moves like that. Then, just as I was about to pass it, the thing did something that I still can't fully explain. The creature stood up, on two legs. It wasn't like a bear standing on its hind legs, where they look awkward and unbalanced. This was different. It stood up straight and tall, almost unnaturally so, and in one smooth motion, it ran off into the woods. Not a regular run either. It was more like a horizontal sprint, fast, low to the ground. There was no hopping like a deer, no heavy lumbering like a bear. This thing just glided, moving with unnatural speed and ease. It was gone in an instant. I could feel my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I didn't know what I'd just seen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A deer? No, it didn't make sense. It wasn't the right shape. A bear? It didn't move like a bear. A person? I don't know what I was thinking at that point. People don't just appear like that in the woods at night, standing up and running off. It didn't look like a person at all. The eyes, though. Those eyes were the strangest part. They weren't like animal eyes, and they certainly didn't reflect light the way a deer's eyes do. They had a strange luminescence to them, almost unnatural. I kept driving, trying to shake the image from my mind. It had to be some kind of trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired. I kept telling myself that it was just a deer, that I was being stupid. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I saw wasn't anything like any animal I'd ever encountered. It didn't match anything I knew. It wasn't a deer, a bear, or any creature I could name. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My eyes kept darting to the sides of the road, half expecting to see that thing again, waiting for me to pass. But there was nothing. The trees stood still, the darkened fields stretching out on either side of me empty. It was like nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget the image of those eyes, the strange way it moved, and how it stood up like it wasn't even human. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more the memory lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. When I got home, I sat in my car for a while, just staring out at the empty road, trying to make sense of it. I kept telling myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that I was just tired, that I was probably imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. It didn't feel like something explainable. It felt like something out of place, something that didn't belong in those woods. I had no idea what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't normal. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? A tired guy driving late at night in the woods, seeing things? I'd sound like an idiot. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about those woods. Something wasn't right, and that thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some animal or person. The next Saturday, I drove out again. I didn't want to. I was scared to, honestly. But I had to. Band practice was the same as always. I drove home late, just like I always did. And as I passed that spot again, my heart started pounding in my chest. My eyes flicked over to the tree line, expecting, almost hoping, that I wouldn't see anything. But there they were, those eyes glowing in the dark, just like last time. This time, I didn't slow down. I didn't want to. I just kept my foot on the gas and sped past the spot, not daring to look. I didn't even want to know what was out there. I kept my eyes straight ahead, my grip tight on the wheel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I heard it. There was something in the woods, just behind the trees, moving again. It wasn't the same as last time, but I could hear it, a low rustle in the brush, like something was following me. I didn't look. I just drove, faster this time, desperate to get away from that place, from whatever it was. When I finally got home that night, I knew I wouldn't drive that road the same way again. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it was something. Something out there in the woods. Something that didn't belong. I started working the graveyard shift at the hotel last year, right around the time it was built. The hotel was new, modern, and shiny, tucked away just off the highway. It had been constructed right over a pasture that had belonged to a farmer who still lived next door. It didn't seem strange at first. Most people wouldn't notice the odd connection between the pasture and the hotel, but I did. Every time I'd head out for a break or just walk past the back doors, I'd catch glimpses of the land next door, the wide open expanse of grass that stretched out beyond the hotel parking lot, and the occasional rustle of something moving in the distance. The graveyard shift, for the most part, was uneventful. I'd sit at the front desk, keep an eye on the security cameras, check emails, do a little bit of internet browsing when it was quiet. The hotel had no late-night guests, not usually, and even if there was an emergency or a problem, it wasn't anything more than handling a drunk guest or checking in someone who'd just driven in late. It was a pretty dull job overall, but it paid the bills, and I liked the peace of the night shift. There was a certain comfort to knowing that the world was mostly asleep when I was at work. That's how it was most nights, until one night when I was standing at the desk, just past 3 a.m., feeling like I could barely keep my eyes open. I was doing what I usually did during these hours. I was browsing the internet, scrolling through random stuff, half paying attention to everything around me. The front door was clearly visible from where I was standing, the big glass sliding doors leading outside into the parking lot and the distant pasture. There was nothing much to see at this hour, except for the occasional passing car on the highway just down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I was so tired that I barely registered anything happening around me, but then something caught my eye. At first, it was just a quick flash of white. So quick, in fact, that I almost doubted I had seen anything at all. It could have been a trick of the light, or my tired eyes playing games with me. But there it was again, this time slower, more deliberate. A flash of something white, moving outside the door. I squinted, trying to focus. At this hour, with the dim lights outside and the darkness swallowing up everything beyond the door, I couldn't quite make out what it was. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, and walked closer to the door to get a better look. Maybe it was just a stray cat. There were plenty of them around here, darting in and out of the parking lot, skirting the hotel's edges. But something about this movement seemed off, like it was too big, too strange. I leaned forward, pressing my palm against the cool glass of the door, trying to see out into the night. The instant I looked out, my heart skipped a beat. A large, white mass stood out in the darkness. At first, it seemed like the shape was too big for a cat, but I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was standing near the edge of the parking lot, close to the gravel drive. I could barely make out the outline, but it was a solid, sizable thing. It didn't look like a cat at all, not unless it was some sort of freakishly large, mutant feline. My brain raced, trying to figure out what was going on. I stepped away from the desk, moving cautiously toward the door. I had no idea what I was about to face, but I figured I'd better check it out. Maybe it was some sort of animal, or maybe just a trick of the light, but either way, it was best to be sure. As I reached the door, I could feel a slight coldness in the air, like the wind had picked up a little. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking. The night was quiet except for the faint hum of cars in the distance, but nothing seemed unusual at first. Then I saw it again. This time, the mass was moving, slowly, deliberately. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what it was. There was a moment of hesitation before my mind pieced it together. For horses. Horses were loitering in front of the hotel, just outside the parking lot, grazing on whatever grass they could find in the small patch of lawn. They were large, impressive animals, and their white coats almost glowed in the dim light. I was too stunned to react at first. Horses? In the parking lot? At this hour? I stood there, frozen for a few moments, not knowing what to do. It didn't occur to me right away where they'd come from. I had never seen these horses before, and there was no stable nearby, no obvious reason for them to be here. I couldn't make sense of it. The hotel didn't offer any sort of training for handling horses. We didn't have a barn or any place for them to stay, so what were they doing here? The thought of these massive creatures just wandering around in the dark, especially with the highway so close by, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't want to risk them getting spooked and running into traffic. I took a slow, uncertain step toward them, trying to assess the situation. The horses were calm, standing there in the grass, their heads down as they grazed, their bodies blocking the view of the street. It seemed almost surreal, like some sort of dream or nightmare. The more I looked at them, the more out of place they seemed, just standing there in front of a modern hotel, in the middle of the night. There was no one around. No rider, no owner, nothing. It was just the horses and me, standing in the parking lot. My first instinct was to call someone. But who? Who could I call about a situation like this? The hotel didn't have any horse management policies. The farmer next door? Maybe. But I had no idea how to handle this situation. I didn't know if they belonged to him, or if they had wandered off somewhere else. In the end, I decided to call the police. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd need to do, but I had no other choice. I picked up the phone, dialed the non-emergency number, and waited while the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered, and I quickly realized I'd called the wrong number. Sorry, I said, feeling a little awkward. I meant to call the non-emergency line. I don't know how to explain this, but there are unattended horses outside my hotel. The operator paused for a moment, probably wondering if I was joking. What do you mean by unattended horses? She asked. I mean, there are 4 horses in front of my hotel. I don't know where they came from, but they're just standing there. There was another pause, and I could almost hear the operator processing my words. Okay, sir, we'll send someone out to check it out. Just stay inside and keep an eye on them until help arrives. All right, thanks, I replied and hung up. I stood at the door for a while longer, watching the horses as they moved slowly around the parking lot. They didn't seem aggressive, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I had no idea what had brought them here, or why they were just hanging around. It was a bizarre feeling, knowing that I was alone with them, and that no one else was around to help. As I waited for the authorities, I kept glancing outside, watching the horses. Eventually, I saw the flashing lights of a police car in the distance. The horses hadn't moved. They were still there, just as calm and placid as before. When the police car arrived, I walked out to meet them. We got a call about some loose horses, one of the officers said, clearly skeptical. Yeah, I don't know how they got here, I told him. They were just out front when I looked out the window. The officer nodded, and the other officer got out of the car to approach the horses. They moved slowly, trying not to startle them. The horses didn't seem to care much about their presence, just lazily looking up as the officers made their way closer. After a while, the officers managed to guide the horses back toward the pasture behind the hotel, where they'd likely come from. They walked away from the hotel without causing any trouble, and I was left standing there, feeling relieved that the situation was over, but also a little shaken. By the time the horses were safely back behind the fence, it was nearing dawn. The night was finally starting to give way to the first light of morning. The police left without much fanfare, and I returned to the front desk, still trying to shake off the oddness of the whole event. The rest of the night went by without incident, and by the time my shift ended, the horses were nothing more than a strange memory. The next day, I saw them again, grazing peacefully in the pasture behind the hotel. It was like nothing had happened. I never heard any stories about the horses or how they ended up in front of the hotel that night, and as far as I knew, they were just the farmer's horses, nothing out of the ordinary. But after that night, the quiet of the graveyard shift felt a little less peaceful. There was something unsettling about the way the horses had appeared out of nowhere, standing in front of the hotel like some kind of eerie omen. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to deal with during a night shift at a hotel, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about the entire situation. Maybe it was just the odd timing of it all, or maybe it was the idea of these giant, silent creatures lurking just outside in the dark. Either way, I wouldn't forget that night anytime soon. That night, I was working the late shift at Domino's Pizza in the early 90s, around the time I was an assistant manager. It was just after 11 p.m., and we were always busy with deliveries, especially on weekends. The store was still buzzing, a mix of ringing phones, the whir of the pizza oven, and the quiet chatter of my coworkers. I wasn't just the assistant manager at the time. I was also expected to deliver when it got busy. So when the next order came through, I grabbed it without thinking twice. It was a delivery to one of the middle-income neighborhoods in town. It wasn't far from the store, about a 5-minute drive, so it didn't seem like a big deal. I remember pulling up to the house, and instantly something felt off. It was one of those old 2-story homes with a decent-sized porch. But there was no light on, no porch light, no lights inside the house at all. That wasn't unusual for a lot of the houses in that neighborhood at the time. Some people just didn't bother with the lights, but our standard procedure for situations like this was clear. If the porch light wasn't on, we were supposed to drive down the street, find a payphone, and call the number on the order. That way, if it was a setup, we weren't walking straight into a robbery. But I didn't always follow that rule. I wasn't exactly a rule follower, never had been. Still, this time, as I sat there idling in my car for a second, I felt something gnawing at me. It was that gut feeling, you know? I didn't really think much of it, just brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake it. Something didn't sit right. So instead of just ignoring my instincts like I usually did, I turned the car around and drove 2 blocks to the payphone. It wasn't far, so I decided it would only take a minute. I grabbed the receiver, punched in the number, and listened to the ringing. It was quiet out there, no cars passing, no people walking around. It was one of those eerie, still nights where everything seems too quiet, too calm. Then, the voice on the other end was nothing but a dial tone. The number was disconnected. Now, I was starting to get that uneasy feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what it was, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone, debating my next move. I had one more call I was supposed to make according to company policy. If I couldn't reach anyone on the second call, I was supposed to just turn around and go back to the store. No exceptions. I looked back towards the neighborhood. The house with no lights, the one I had just driven by. It seemed like it was waiting for something. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a Pizza Hut car parked across the street at the end of the block. It was one of those old-school cars with the drive-through window on the side, the kind they used back then to make deliveries. I didn't think much of it, really. We were all in competition, and you could spot each other when you were out on the road. No big deal. I decided to try calling again, just for the hell of it. I dialed the number once more, and once again, there was nothing but the disconnected line. I sat there for a few seconds, thinking it over. What were the odds that both deliveries would be to the same house at the same time? I didn't know. It didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain why. I decided to go back to the house and see if anyone would come to the door, just to make sure everything was okay. I turned the car around again and headed back. As I drove up the street, I saw the Pizza Hut car again. This time, though, it was parked right in the driveway of the house I had just been to. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure why it felt so strange, but I had an awful feeling that something was very wrong. I parked behind the Pizza Hut car, and immediately, I noticed something big on the ground next to the open driver's door. It looked like a person, but I wasn't sure. The driveway was lined with tall evergreen trees, their shadows stretching across the path. The street lights were far enough away that they didn't reach the driveway, making everything darker than usual. I slowly stepped out of the car and walked towards the figure. My first thought was that the Pizza Hut driver might have had a heart attack or something, so I rushed over to see if I could help. But as I got closer, something didn't sit right. I froze. The figure on the ground wasn't just unconscious, it was something far worse. It was the driver, all right, but his skull had been caved in so badly that I could actually see his brains. The side of his head was a mess, and blood pooled around him, soaking into the pavement. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Without thinking, I ran back to my car and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I had to get out of there. I wasn't sure what had happened or who did it, but I knew I needed to get help. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the street and heading straight to the payphone. I called the cops first. I didn't know what else to do. The operator sounded confused, but I gave them the address and told them what I had found. My voice was shaky, but I tried to keep it together. After hanging up, I called the store, told them what had happened, and asked them to contact Pizza Hut. I wasn't sure if that was necessary, but something told me it might help. Then I just waited. I sat in my car, staring at the payphone, waiting for the cops to arrive. Every few minutes, I'd look back down the street, expecting to see someone, anyone, coming to help, but the street stayed empty. The night stretched on in silence. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. I kept thinking about the Pizza Hut driver. What had happened to him? Why was he out there, in the driveway, like that? What had he been doing when it all went down? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cop car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out and came over to me. I told them everything I had seen, the disconnected number, the Pizza Hut car, finding the driver. They nodded, asked a few questions, and told me to hang tight while they investigated. I followed them back to the house, still a little dazed. The detective in charge was a tall guy with a stern look, and he wasted no time getting to work. He was methodical as he checked the area. They quickly found the same thing I had, the dead driver, the blood, and the carnage on the ground. But that wasn't all. As they moved around the driveway, the detective noticed something odd in the bushes next to the driveway. It was a realty sign. The power to the house had been cut, and the house was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. It was a shell. The detective paused, his expression darkening. He pointed to the bushes, and that's when he noticed something else. 2 sets of footprints leading from the bushes to the front door, then back again. It dawned on me then. Whoever had ordered the pizza, whether it was me or Pizza Hut, had been the target. It was a setup. They had ordered from both places and planned to rob whoever arrived first. The thing was, I hadn't followed the usual protocol. I hadn't gotten out of my car to check the porch light, and I had gone to the payphone instead. That extra minute had saved my life. If I'd gone to the door the first time, it would have been me lying on the ground next to the driver. But because I didn't, I had walked away with my life. I never forgot that night. It stayed with me, a constant reminder of how important it is to trust your gut, even when everything seems like it's business as usual. I never knocked on another door without the front porch light being on again, and from then on, I always remembered how a simple decision, one that seemed unimportant, had saved my life. I learned the hard way that sometimes, even when you don't know why, you have to listen to that gut feeling. It could be the difference between life and death. The detectives told me later that the people behind the whole thing were caught, but not until after several more robberies and assaults had occurred. They were careful, meticulous, and had planned their attacks for a while, trying to catch delivery drivers off guard. But for me, I was just grateful that I had made the choice I did that night. It could have been me lying in that driveway, and I'd never even know why it happened. The air was cold when we arrived at the campground, a chill that bit into your skin the moment you stepped out of the car. My friend Mark and I had planned this overnight hike to the summit of a mountain in Alaska for weeks. The route to the peak wasn't an easy one, but we were prepared for the challenge. The trail led us across ridges, down into a valley, and then up onto another set of mountain ridges. The kind of terrain that made you feel small, like the mountains themselves were watching your every step. It was a trek that would take at least 2 days. There was no way to reach the summit and come back in a single day without putting ourselves at risk. So, we had to camp for the night somewhere along the way. We chose the valley between the 2 ridges as our campsite. It was a natural shelter from the wind, and though it was remote, it was the only place that offered some kind of protection from the harsh elements that surrounded it. As we set up our tent and started organizing our gear, I noticed something that stuck with me. We were the only people there. The campground was deserted, no other vehicles in sight, no other hikers, nothing. The nearest town was more than 100 miles away, and the only road leading in and out of the campground was the one we had arrived on. That night, as we were lying in our sleeping bags, the sounds of the wilderness surrounded us. Distant winds, the occasional rustling of animals in the brush, the ever-present hum of nature. I closed my eyes, trying to let the exhaustion of the hike lull me into sleep, but it wasn't long before I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow, methodical, almost deliberate. They weren't the kind of footsteps you'd expect from a wild animal like a bear or a moose. No, these were human steps, too deliberate, too controlled. And there was something else, raspy breathing, like someone who had been walking for a while but was struggling with each breath. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark was lying next to me, still. He must have heard it too, but neither of us moved for a moment. We just listened. The footsteps grew closer, drawing near to our tent. They were slow, almost like they were trying to avoid making noise, but it was impossible to ignore. My first thought was that it could be another hiker, maybe someone who had lost their way, but the breathing didn't sit right with me. It was too erratic, too unsettling. "Who's out there?" I called out softly, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, just the sound of those slow, deliberate steps. I swallowed hard, the grip on my rifle tightening. We had brought a bolt-action rifle with us for protection against bears, and now, as the footsteps grew louder, the weight of it in my hands felt more real than ever before. The air in the tent felt thicker, colder, almost as if something else had entered with those footsteps, something I couldn't name, but knew was there. I called out again, louder this time. "Who's there?" "We're armed." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sound of our clothes drying rack, the one we'd set up outside to dry off some gear from the hike, crashed to the ground, followed by a harsh scraping noise, like someone had shoved it violently out of the way. My heart skipped a beat. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't even something that sounded like it should be in the wild. I whispered to Mark, my voice barely above a whisper, "Stay still. Don't make a sound." The footsteps continued, growing faster, more urgent, and then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the person was gone. They ran past our tent, moving with a speed that made no sense given how slow they had been walking earlier. The sound of their running steps was muffled, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. There was no sound of a pack, no jingling of gear, nothing. Just the eerie silence of someone running at full speed through the wilderness, but without the normal sounds that came with a person's movement. It felt wrong, like they didn't belong there. I lay still in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that it was just a random hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. It didn't make sense that someone would be out here, in this desolate place, in the dead of night, without any kind of warning or reason. Mark, his voice shaky, finally spoke up. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I whispered back, feeling the weight of my fear pressing down on me. But we're not alone. We spent the rest of the night in silence, barely able to sleep, our ears straining for any sound that might indicate that the person, whoever they were, was still out there. Every little noise sent us into a panic. The wind picking up, the rustling of leaves, the sound of an owl in the distance, everything felt like a threat. When morning finally came, the first light of dawn slowly poured into the valley, bringing with it a sense of false comfort. I didn't feel safe anymore, though. I didn't feel comfortable stepping out of the tent. But we had a job to do. We had to make it to the summit. So reluctantly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The valley was quiet. Too quiet. As soon as my boots hit the ground, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in knots. The clothes drying rack we had left outside, the one that had been knocked over in the night, was now completely destroyed. It was in tatters, scattered across the ground, pieces of fabric and wire bent and twisted in unnatural ways. It looked like something had taken it and ripped it apart, not just knocked it over. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the footprints. Small, booted tracks in the ground, leading right up to our tent, and then back out toward the ridge. They were barely visible in the soft earth, but they were there, clear as day. Whoever had been out there had been close. Too close. Mark and I didn't speak for a while, just stood there, staring at the tracks. Neither of us knew what to say. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I didn't want to think about who, or what, had been near us in the night. We packed up our gear in silence, moving quickly, and began our trek up the mountain. I didn't want to stay in the valley any longer, and I certainly didn't want to stick around and find out who had been out there with us. I could feel the weight of the night's events pressing down on me with each step we took. The peacefulness of the morning felt like a lie. The wilderness around us felt empty now, desolate, like it was holding a secret. When we reached the peak and started making our way back down, we didn't slow down. We didn't take in the view. We didn't stop for pictures. We just moved. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from the shadows of the trees. The feeling of being hunted, of being followed. We made it back to the campground faster than I thought possible, practically running the last stretch of the trail. When we arrived, I expected to see other hikers or maybe some park rangers, but the place was still empty. Not a soul in sight. That's when I knew. Whoever had been out there with us, they were long gone by now. But the question that haunted me was why they had been there in the first place. Were they just lost? Were they looking for something, or someone? And what the hell were they doing, creeping around our camp in the middle of the night? I haven't gone camping since that trip. Not like that. Not alone. Not in places so remote. There's a part of me that knows I'll never fully understand what happened that night, and maybe that's what scares me the most. Whoever that person was, I'm certain they were no ordinary hiker. They weren't just lost. I'll never know what their intentions were, but I know one thing for sure. They were watching us, waiting for something. And for some reason, they never came back. After that trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness had its own way of keeping secrets. And some of those secrets are better left untouched. I worked overnight security at a boatyard in Rhode Island about 10 years ago, a job that seemed pretty straightforward at first, but turned out to be far more unsettling than I ever imagined. The boatyard was a vast, rusted industrial lot, shrouded in fog most nights, with massive warehouses and docks spread out in every direction. They assembled tugs there, which meant there were large, heavy equipment parts scattered everywhere, along with the constant hum of machinery, even though most of it was off during the night. There was a certain eeriness to it, especially when you're alone in the middle of the night, surrounded by the stillness, save for the occasional sound of distant waves or a faint rustling in the dark corners of the yard. At first, I was just grateful for the job. It paid double what I could make at most places, and I didn't have to do much except for my hourly rounds. The hours were long, though, 12-hour shifts from dusk to dawn, and you'd spend most of that time alone, sitting in a small security shack with the quiet buzz of the camera monitors keeping you company. I would bring my homework or play video games to kill time, but the weird occurrences would start almost immediately, and they would only get stranger as the months went on. One of the first things that happened was something I couldn't quite explain. I was making my usual walk through one of the larger warehouses, the kind with towering metal beams and half-completed tugs sitting in various stages of assembly. I was walking down an aisle between these massive machines, the only sound being my footsteps echoing off the cold concrete floor. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something above me, like the sound of claws scrabbling on metal. It stopped as soon as I looked up, but I couldn't see anything. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal or just a trick of the wind, but it kept happening. I'd walk further down the aisle, and I'd hear it again, scratching, scampering, something big moving above me. My heart started to race. I spun around, but there was nothing. The warehouse was as still as ever. I tried to shake it off, but every time I took another few steps, I'd hear the sound again, and this time, it was closer. I rushed back to the security room, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. I pulled up the cameras, scanning through the different angles, and that's when I saw it. A massive cat, probably a mountain lion, moving around the rafters. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. This wasn't some stray cat. This was something big, something dangerous, and it was inside the warehouse. I called animal control right away. They were responsive, but they took hours to get there. I had to sit there in the dark, watching the cameras, making sure the cat wasn't anywhere near the entrances. 5 hours later, they finally caught it. They came with all their equipment and corralled it into a cage. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. The very next night, the same damn thing happened. I saw the cat again, stalking through the rafters in another warehouse. I called animal control once more, and they arrived within an hour this time. But when they got there, they couldn't catch it. I watched them on the cameras, walking around right under the animal, but they couldn't see it. They walked right past it, not even knowing it was overhead. The thing was toying with them, staying just out of sight. After hours of searching, they left empty-handed. It wasn't long before I started questioning what was going on. Was it the same cat, or were there multiple cats? I couldn't make sense of it. Animal control told me they couldn't catch it, and it didn't help that every time they showed up, they looked more and more frustrated. I wasn't sure what to think. It started to feel like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then, a few nights later, something happened that made my skin crawl. I was walking across one of the empty sections of the yard, where the fog clung to the ground in thick tendrils, and the only sound was the occasional creak of rusted metal. I was heading toward the dock to check on some of the boats when something heavy hit me in the leg. I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. My heart skipped a beat as I looked down to see a 5-pound wrench lying there, inches from my foot. There was no way it could have fallen from above. The nearest roof was far too high, and the wrench didn't seem like it had just fallen from the sky. Someone would have had to throw it at me like a football, and I couldn't figure out who or what would have done that. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing. just the eerie, fog-choked emptiness of the yard. I didn't know what to make of it, but I felt my heart thumping in my chest, my instincts telling me that something wasn't right. A few days later, I found myself in the bathroom, taking a quick break. The whole building was quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of a machine starting up or a truck engine rumbling in the distance. I was sitting in one of the stalls when I heard it, the sound of the giant hangar door opening. It was a loud, mechanical groan, followed by the whirring of motors, but I knew it couldn't have been triggered by anyone. The controls were locked, and I had checked them earlier. I stood up, pulling up my pants, and decided to investigate. I walked out of the stall, but by the time I reached the door, it slammed open with such force that I jumped, nearly giving myself a heart attack. The sound of the door smashing against the wall echoed through the bathroom, and I could feel my pulse racing. But it didn't stop there. Every stall door in the room flung open at the same time. It was as if someone had triggered a series of switches all at once, but no one was there. I was left standing there, trying to make sense of what just happened. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but nothing made sense. Why would the door slam like that? Who could have triggered all the doors at once? I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Then, a few nights later, I had another strange encounter with the seagulls. They were always around, perched on the docks or flying over the water, keeping an eye on everything. But one night, I noticed something odd. A small flock of them, maybe 5 to 10, suddenly swooped into the air and clustered together. It was the strangest thing. I had never seen seagulls fly so tightly together before. They moved as one, as if guided by some unseen force. I stopped walking and watched them, my confusion growing. As I walked across the yard, the birds followed me, always staying at a distance, but never quite leaving me. I'd stop, and they'd stop. I'd start walking again, and they'd follow, fluttering behind me in a tight formation. When I walked into the guard shack, they all landed on the roof at once. It was like they were watching me, observing me, and it gave me an unsettling feeling deep in my chest. I couldn't explain it. The final incident that really shook me happened a few months into the job. There was an accident on site. A worker fell through a roof while repairing it, not wearing a harness, and hit the machinery below. He died instantly. The whole place was quiet after that, a somber mood hanging over the boatyard for days. The following day, the roof of the CEO's office caved in during a big international conference call, injuring him and sending him to the hospital. I couldn't understand how the roof, which had only been recently constructed, could have collapsed like that. There was no indication of any structural problems. It didn't make sense, but it only added to the unease that was building. One day, while I was sitting in the security room, reflecting on everything that had happened, it hit me. This place was cursed. Something about it felt off. The workers came and went, the animals seemed to behave strangely, and the strange occurrences kept stacking up. I realized that, despite the good pay, I couldn't handle it anymore. I wasn't the type of person to buy into superstitions or ghost stories, but there was something about the place that got under my skin. I didn't last much longer after that. I put in my notice and moved on, but even now, when I drive through Rhode Island, I can't help but wonder about the boatyard. The place felt alive with something I couldn't explain, and I don't think I'll ever understand what it was. But I can tell you this, it wasn't just the fog or the darkness that made it eerie. There was something deeper, something unsettling that lingered in the air, and I'm glad I'm no longer there to feel it. I had just finished my last class for the day. The day was already drawing to a close when my mom, who had flown in to visit for a few days, settled into her bed in my small, on-campus apartment. I had invited my boyfriend over, and we planned to take a walk, mostly to catch up and get a bit of fresh air. Nothing out of the ordinary. We had done it 1,000 times before. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m., and the campus was pretty quiet. The streets were mostly empty, with just a few students walking around, either heading to the library or stumbling back to their dorms after a long night of studying. My boyfriend and I, having spent most of the day inside, were looking forward to stepping outside and having a little time to ourselves. It was one of those nights where the cool air felt good on your skin, and everything was just calm enough to feel peaceful. We left the apartment and walked down the stairs. The building where I lived wasn't exactly in the heart of the campus, but it wasn't far either. It was just a few minutes' walk from the main roads, so even though it wasn't exactly bustling, we weren't too isolated. The streets were lit by a series of street lamps casting pools of orange light, making everything look softer in the night. We walked hand in hand, passing familiar sights, chatting casually about our day. We walked to our usual spot, an empty courtyard behind the student union. It was quiet, secluded, and we'd always felt safe there. I didn't think anything was off as we stood there for a few minutes, smoking and just enjoying the silence. The courtyard was surrounded by tall buildings, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. It was peaceful, but when we decided to head back, that's when things started to feel different. We were about 60 seconds away from the lobby entrance when we walked past a large statue. It was this massive figure, a few feet taller than a grown man, with dark, weathered stone that made it seem even more imposing under the streetlights. It sat at the corner of the street, just across from my building. I hadn't really thought about it much before, just another campus feature, part of the scenery. But something felt off that night. I don't know what made my boyfriend speak up, but he did. He whispered, almost under his breath, "Don't panic and don't run." But there was a guy standing in the shadow of that statue, and I think he's following us now. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to alarm him or freak myself out, but I glanced over my shoulder anyway. Sure enough, there was a man walking behind us, about 20 feet back, moving steadily along the sidewalk. He wasn't following directly, but there was no mistaking it. He had picked up his pace once we'd passed the statue. The way he moved made it clear that he wasn't just walking casually. His strides were deliberate, and even from a distance, it felt like he was closing in on us, even if he was still a good ways away. I kept my face forward, but a small knot of unease twisted in my stomach. We kept walking at the same pace, but now every step felt heavier. It wasn't like I was panicking. I wasn't terrified, but the situation was starting to feel off in a way I couldn't explain. I heard my boyfriend's voice again, this time more urgent. "Just stay calm, don't look at him. Just keep walking." I nodded, my grip tightening on his hand, and we continued. But I noticed my own pace was subtly shifting, faster than it had been before. I could hear the guy's footsteps now, definitely behind us. I didn't want to turn around again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know just how close he was getting. The street was empty, just us, the man, and the quiet hum of the night around us. Nothing seemed unusual, but everything felt wrong. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my mind racing through the worst-case scenarios. What if he had bad intentions? What if he wanted to hurt us? What if we were about to be in real trouble? It was only a few more steps to the door. The entrance was in sight, the lobby just ahead, and all I wanted was to get inside. Safe. We reached the door, and without even thinking, I fished out my student ID and held it tight in my hand. It was one of those old-school doors with a delayed close, and I knew if I didn't act fast, we'd be in trouble. I didn't even want to let the door close on its own. I wanted it shut behind us firmly, before the guy could catch up. I reached the door first and pulled it open. Without saying a word, I shoved it wide enough for both of us to slip inside. The weight of the door was enough that it started to swing back, but I held it, pulling it the rest of the way shut, making sure it was locked in place. I breathed for the first time in what felt like minutes. My heart was hammering, my palms were sweaty, and I had a terrible knot in my stomach. We didn't talk, we just moved quickly. The elevator was just down the hall. I knew if we got in, we would be fine. The building wasn't big, but the elevator was our safest bet. We wouldn't have to deal with anything else until we got up to the apartment. But just as we neared the elevator, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the door behind us. Rattle, rattle, rattle. It wasn't like a normal knock. It was frantic, almost like someone was yanking at the door, trying to force it open. I froze. My boyfriend's eyes shot to mine, and for a moment, we both just stood there, stunned. Neither of us could move. Rattle, rattle, rattle. I knew what was happening. The guy outside, the one who had been following us, was now trying to get in. He didn't belong there. He didn't have a student ID to get in, and he certainly wasn't a guest of anyone in the building. It became clear in that moment. We had been right. We had avoided something bad. My boyfriend grabbed my hand, his grip tight, and we sprinted toward the elevator. We hit the button. It felt like time was stretching out. The seconds felt like minutes, and every second was another second we were exposed. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't gotten inside in time. What was he planning to do if he caught up to us? What would have happened if the door hadn't shut when it did? The elevator door finally opened. We didn't hesitate. We stepped inside, and I hit the button for my floor with a trembling finger. The door closed behind us, sealing us in. We didn't speak at first. Both of us just stood there, staring at the lights as the elevator climbed upward. I couldn't stop looking at the little numbers as they ticked away, each one a step closer to our safety. When we reached the top, we didn't waste any time. I was still holding on to my student ID, still in my hand like a shield, even though I knew we were safe for now. We walked quickly down the hallway, not daring to look back. As soon as we reached my apartment door, I fumbled with the keys. It felt like everything around me was moving in slow motion, like the weight of the night was closing in on me. Finally, the door clicked open. I stepped inside, my heart still pounding in my chest. My boyfriend followed me inside, and I quickly locked the door behind us. We stood there for a moment, just breathing, letting the normalcy of being back inside settle in. We didn't talk much after that. There was a heavy silence between us. I was still shaken up by the whole thing, but we didn't need words. We both knew something had happened, something that could have gone horribly wrong. I don't know what the guy's intentions were. I don't know what he had planned, but I know we were lucky. He hadn't managed to get inside, and we had avoided whatever he might have been after. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I stayed up, just making sure the locks on the doors were secure. My mom didn't wake up until the morning, and I didn't tell her what had happened. There was no need to worry her. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something terrible. It stayed with me for a long time. That night changed the way I looked at my surroundings. It made me more aware, more cautious. Looking back, I'm just thankful we were alert, that we trusted our instincts. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't noticed the guy, if we hadn't made it inside in time. But I know one thing for sure, we got lucky, and I'll never forget that night. I was the navigation officer aboard the research vessel Calypso, a 70-meter steel-hulled ship with a white superstructure and a blue stripe running along her sides. She was equipped with the latest in sonar, radar, and infrared technology, and had been my home for the past 6 months as we conducted marine studies across the South Pacific. Our latest assignment had brought us to the remote coastal waters of Papua New Guinea, a region known for its rich biodiversity and complex maritime geography. It was late in the evening, around 10 p.m., when we arrived at a small, unnamed bay along the northern coast. The sky was overcast, and a light mist hung in the air, diffusing the glow of the ship's deck lights. We had been sailing for hours, navigating through narrow channels and avoiding hidden reefs, relying heavily on our updated nautical charts and GPS systems. As we dropped anchor in the calm waters of the bay, I made my way to the chart room to log our position. The chart I was using was an official AUS paper chart, produced by the Australian Hydrographic Service and recognized by the Papua New Guinea National Maritime Safety Authority. As I marked our coordinates, I noticed a small annotation near our location. Native village reported in the area. There were no visible signs of habitation, no lights, no fires, no movement on the shore. The dense jungle pressed right up to the water's edge, and the silence was profound. I made a mental note of the annotation, but didn't give it much thought. Back on the bridge, I turned on all the deck and underwater lights. The ship's powerful halogen beams illuminated the surrounding waters, creating a shimmering pool of light that extended about 25 yards from the hull. Beyond that, the mist rendered everything into an impenetrable darkness. I left the bridge door open, enjoying the warm, humid air and the gentle sounds of the tropical night. As I settled into my watch, I began to hear faint splashes in the water. At first, I assumed it was fish attracted to the underwater lights, a common occurrence in these waters. I stepped out onto the deck to take a look, expecting to see schools of fish darting through the illuminated water. But the surface was calm, undisturbed. Puzzled, I returned to the bridge, but the splashing continued intermittently. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. I couldn't determine the direction it was coming from, and the mist made it impossible to see beyond the immediate vicinity of the ship. Curious and slightly uneasy, I decided to check the infrared camera system. The ship was equipped with a state-of-the-art thermal imaging setup, allowing us to detect heat signatures in complete darkness. I switched on the monitors and adjusted the settings. What I saw made my blood run cold. Surrounding the ship, just beyond the reach of our lights, were numerous small heat signatures, dozens of them. As I fine-tuned the image, the shapes became clearer. Outrigger canoes, each with 2 or 3 occupants, sitting motionless in the water. They formed a loose perimeter around the ship, maintaining a consistent distance, just outside the illuminated area. The canoes were traditional Papuan designs, likely carved from single logs with attached outriggers for stability. Some had simple sails, while others were propelled by paddles. The occupants sat silently, watching the ship. Occasionally, one would paddle slightly to adjust their position, but otherwise they remained still. I felt a wave of vulnerability wash over me. Despite the size and technological superiority of our vessel, we were isolated, surrounded by unknown observers in a remote bay far from any official support. I quickly called for a deckhand to join me, and together we walked the decks, making our presence known. We didn't want to appear threatening, but we also wanted to convey that we were alert and aware. The canoes remained throughout the night, maintaining their silent vigil. On the infrared monitors, I could see the occupants shifting occasionally, but they made no move to approach or communicate. The atmosphere was tense, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. As dawn broke, the mist began to lift, and the silhouettes of the canoes became visible to the naked eye. The occupants were men, women, and even children, all observing us with a mix of curiosity and caution. With the arrival of daylight, the mood shifted. Some of the canoes began to approach the ship slowly. We prepared to receive them, setting up a makeshift trading post on the deck. The villagers offered handmade crafts, fresh fruits, and fish in exchange for tools, clothing, and other goods. Communication was limited, but smiles and gestures bridged the gap. One of our team members, who had some knowledge of the local languages, learned that the village nearby had not seen a ship in their bay for decades. Our arrival had been unexpected, and the villagers had spent the night observing us to determine our intentions. The experience left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of the vastness of the world and the diverse ways in which people live. Despite the initial fear and uncertainty, the encounter turned into a meaningful exchange, grounded in mutual respect and curiosity. As we departed the bay later that day, I looked back at the shoreline, now dotted with waving villagers. The experience had started as a tense and eerie night, but ended with a profound connection to a community that had remained largely untouched by the outside world. It was a long ride on the highway in Denmark, the wind slapping my face as I revved the engine, the hum of my motorcycle filling the space around me. The highway stretched out, unending, the trees lining it on both sides, giving the world a tunnel-like feeling. The traffic wasn't bad, but it wasn't empty either. Cars buzzed past me at regular intervals, each one looking like a little dot on the blacktop in my rearview mirror. I'd been on the road for hours, so when I saw a rest stop on the side, I decided it was time to take a break. It wasn't much of a stop, just a parking lot and a solitary toilet block surrounded by dense trees. No gas stations, no restaurants. Just a little patch of tarmac where travelers could pull off and take a breath. But the quiet of it was appealing, and I was ready for a rest. I pulled off the highway and coasted into the parking lot, stopping near the back, away from the small group of cars that were parked closer to the entrance. As I took off my helmet and set it on my bike, I noticed there was only one other car in the lot. It was a beat-up station wagon, its faded blue paint chipped and scratched. The kind of car that looked like it had been through a lot. A man was standing beside it, leaning against the car, looking at me. He didn't seem threatening at first glance, but there was something about the way he stood there, like he was waiting for something. He approached me as I was stretching my legs, and I could already feel a slight unease creeping in. He was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with thin, wiry hair and a weathered face. He had an air about him that wasn't quite right, something a bit off. He was dressed in a button-down shirt and khakis, his shoes polished but worn, not really the attire of someone who looked like they'd been traveling for a long time. He introduced himself as a German chemistry professor. That was his first odd detail. A chemistry professor, he said, but I had a hard time imagining a guy like him as anything remotely academic. His clothes didn't match the description of someone in the profession, and he didn't carry himself in a way that spoke of education. Still, I didn't push it. "I've been sleeping in my car," he said, and I could see the frustration on his face. But I locked myself out of it. "The keys are inside, and I can't get in." I need to call for assistance. Could I use your phone? I didn't have any reason to distrust him. Not at that point. Maybe it was his age or the fact that he seemed genuinely helpless. But I handed over my phone without a second thought. He muttered something to the person on the other end of the call, probably roadside assistance, judging by the way he spoke, and then hung up. By now, I was ready to move on. I had other things to do, and I was in no mood for a long conversation, but he kept talking, not in a pushy way, more in a rambling, aimless manner. He told me about his trip, about the places he'd visited, and how he had been on the road for days. But there was something about his tone, something that didn't quite fit. He was nervous, his words almost fumbling, as if he were trying to sound more confident than he felt. I tried to step away politely, glancing over at my bike, but before I could get too far, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. This time, it wasn't just any car, but a rundown van, its body covered in graffiti, and its engine sputtering as it came to a stop next to us. A man climbed out of the driver's seat, his movements slow but purposeful. He looked off. Something about him didn't sit right. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an old denim jacket, a mix of the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in the 80s and someone who had spent too much time hanging around shady places. His eyes were wild, like he hadn't slept in days, and his face had a weathered, almost dirty look to it. His first words hit me like a brick. "How much is that motorcycle worth?" The way he said it wasn't a question. It was more like a statement, and the tone was sharp, with a hint of something threatening behind it. I tried to brush it off, to just act normal, but something in my gut told me this wasn't just a random encounter. He wasn't just admiring my bike, he was sizing me up. He kept talking, rambling on about my bike, telling me how nice it was, how he had always wanted one like it. It was almost like he was trying to make me comfortable, to make me think he was just some guy with no agenda. But then he started telling me his life story, and that's when things really started to feel strange. He was a truck driver, he said, from West Germany, driving through East Germany in the 80s. He told me how he had met an East German girlfriend while on his route. They saw each other every time he was in the country, but one day the Stasi found out about them, and that was the last time he ever saw her. He was convinced the Stasi killed her because of their relationship, but he had no proof. After that, he said he had moved to Norway and worked as a butcher for 10 years. But then, something changed, and he joined the French Foreign Legion. That part got my attention. People don't just join the French Foreign Legion. It's not the kind of thing you do on a whim. And the way he said it made me think he was hiding something more sinister. I didn't trust him at all now. The whole thing felt off. His stories didn't line up. His tone was too rehearsed, too convincing. He wasn't just some lonely truck driver who needed a conversation. I didn't know what he was after, but I had a feeling it wasn't just idle chatter. Was he trying to steal my bike? My wallet? My phone? I couldn't tell. I wanted to get away, to end the conversation, but the professor, who was still locked out of his car, was looking more and more uncomfortable. I noticed him glancing at the van guy, his eyes flicking nervously between him and the car. He looked like he wanted to leave, but couldn't, trapped by his situation. At this point, I decided to press the guy a little, to see what kind of reaction I'd get. I asked him about something I'd heard about the Foreign Legion, a strange rumor that they give you a dog to care for, and then, eventually, make you kill and eat it. The look on his face when I mentioned that was priceless, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, a mix of annoyance and confusion. "No, that's not true," he said, shaking his head. "It's not a dog, it's a rabbit." And then he went on, explaining in great detail how that whole story was a lie, how it was just a rabbit they gave you, not a dog. He talked about it in a way that was so convincing, it almost made me believe him. Almost. And then, just as I was about to try to walk away, he pulled up his sleeve. And there it was, a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but a detailed full-arm sleeve showing the insignia of the French Foreign Legion, the emblem clearly visible. It covered his arm from elbow to wrist, every inch of it, and it was done in fine detail. I'd seen enough tattoos in my life to know that was the real deal. No one just gets a tattoo like that unless they've lived it. That stopped me dead in my tracks. Everything he had said, every weird detail, suddenly made sense. He wasn't lying. Well, maybe he was exaggerating some things, but that tattoo, that was real. He had been in the Foreign Legion. He wasn't just some guy trying to impress me with tall tales. He had lived those stories, had the scars to prove it. I didn't know what to make of it. The guy was a mess, lonely, sure, but real. And then, just as quickly as the tension had built up, the roadside assistance truck for the professor arrived. The crazy guy's face changed, like a switch flipped. He suddenly realized what was happening and became frustrated, muttering under his breath. "If I had known, I could have picked that lock for you," he said, and the professor and the van guy turned to look at the car, now focused on the problem at hand. I didn't want to stick around any longer. Without another word, I swung my leg over my bike, started it up, and made a quick exit. I didn't look back as I sped down the highway, the sound of the engine roaring in my ears. Later, I thought about it. The whole encounter, the strange professor, the wild-eyed van guy, and the tattoo that confirmed his story. I'd never know for sure what he really wanted, but I had a feeling it wasn't anything good. Maybe he was just a lonely man, searching for conversation, or maybe he had something darker in mind. But I didn't care. I was glad to get out of there, away from the rest stop, away from the weirdness, and back on the open road. I didn't want to see that place again, and I sure didn't want to run into any more people like that. Some stories, no matter how real they are better left untold. I used to work at a coffee shop, and let me tell you, opening up at 5 a.m. was never easy. We'd arrive around 4:30 a.m. to start setting up. The place was small, tucked away in a corner of a rundown neighborhood that had seen better days. The area used to be a nice spot, but as the years went by, things started to change. Homelessness, addiction, and mental health issues became more and more common around the block. It was sad, but it was also something we had to deal with daily. Still, I stuck it out for almost 4 years because, honestly, the job wasn't that bad. Plus, it kept me busy. Every week, I worked at least one opening shift, one closing shift, and sometimes even a deep clean shift. We closed at 8 p.m., but didn't leave until around 9 because we had to clean everything up. Deep clean night. That was when we didn't leave until close to 10. Long days, but that was just part of the grind. The first story I have to share happened one morning when I was opening with one of my baristas. I was the supervisor at the time, so I was the one setting up the tills, getting the supplies ready, while my barista was in front brewing the coffee, setting up the teas, and getting the place ready for the day. It was just the two of us in the shop that morning, and everything felt normal. It was still dark outside. The only sound there were of the coffee machines and the quiet hum of the fridge in the back. Suddenly, I heard screaming. I mean, full-on, bloody murder screaming, coming from the front of the store. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the box cutter I kept on me, you never know when you need one, and ran to the front of the store, my mind racing with a million thoughts. What could it be? A break-in? A fight? I had no idea. When I turned the corner to the front of the store, I saw it. My barista was standing by the sink, just frozen, her face pale, tears in her eyes. She was shaking, and standing on the other side of the drive-through window was a man. He was standing there, his face pressed right up against the glass, inches away from her, with the most twisted, terrifying grin I've ever seen. His face was dirty, unkempt, and he had a pink blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His grin was wide, like he thought whatever he was doing was hilarious. I could hear him laughing, a high-pitched, cackling sound, like something out of a horror movie. My barista was still screaming, but the guy didn't seem to care at all. He was too busy enjoying his own twisted amusement. I don't know why, but that just pissed me off. Here was this guy, scaring my employee, standing there like it was some kind of joke. I wasn't about to just let it slide. I wasn't about to open the window and let him in, but I wasn't going to let him scare my barista either. Without thinking, I made eye contact with him through the glass and scowled as hard as I could. I pointed down the street and yelled, "F-U-C-K, off, now." The words came out louder than I expected, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was so angry, but also a little scared. What if he didn't listen? What if he tried to break in? At first, the guy looked a little stunned. He kind of blinked, like he hadn't expected me to react that way. Then, slowly, he took a step back and just stared at me for a second. After a long, tense moment, he mumbled something I couldn't hear, then turned and started stumbling away down the street. He didn't leave right away, though. He lingered, walking back and forth in front of the store, almost like he was trying to figure out what to do next. I kept an eye on him, watching his every move. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity, he finally walked away for good. I waited a few more minutes, just to be sure, and then went back inside to check on my barista. She was still shaken up, but she was okay. I could tell she was terrified, though. I told her to take a break, to calm down, and to sit in the back for a bit. She needed a few minutes to collect herself. I walked around the store, making sure all the doors were locked, and then just stood by the front window for a while, keeping an eye out in case he came back. But he didn't. Eventually, I calmed her down enough to get back to work, but we both knew something had happened that we wouldn't forget anytime soon. That wasn't the only close call I had working there, though. There was another time, a few weeks later, when I was opening with a different barista. This barista was a man, probably in his late 30s. He was a little taller than me and had a no-nonsense attitude. We were used to being the only ones in the parking lot when we arrived. Usually, one of us would get there first, and the other would follow shortly after. On this particular morning, I arrived first. It was still dark outside, and the parking lot was almost empty. I sat in my car for a minute, waiting, listening to the radio while I checked my phone. A few minutes later, I saw my barista's car pull into the lot. It was a small black car, easy to miss in the dark. He parked a few spaces away from me, and I got out of my car to meet him. But just as I did, he started yelling, "Get the fuck away from her." His voice was loud, panicked. He was running toward me, and I froze, completely confused. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. Someone was running away from me, fast, and I had no idea how long they'd been there. I hadn't heard them approach, but apparently, someone had been hiding behind my car, waiting for me to get out. My barista had seen them, though, and his shout had scared the person off. I stood there in complete shock for a few seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. It took me a minute to even process what had just happened. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted, but they had been hiding behind my car, waiting for me to be alone. That realization made my skin crawl. I didn't even want to get in my car after that. My barista made sure I was okay before we went inside and started the day. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. What if he hadn't shown up when he did? What if the guy had attacked me? There was no way to know, and that was the scariest part. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, I was closing the store with another barista, a woman who had been working there for a while. Her partner was picking her up that night, and she had arrived early. So, she sat in the parking lot waiting for him. She hadn't been there for long when she saw something that made her freeze. Someone was crouched behind my car again, just like before. She immediately called her partner, who happened to be a cop. She told him what she'd seen, and he told her to stay put and watch while he called for backup. Then, she went to investigate, walking towards my car cautiously. When the guy saw her coming, he bolted. He ran so fast, like he was scared out of his mind. Her partner arrived shortly after, and they both walked me to my car. I was shaken, but grateful they were there. I didn't feel safe alone anymore, not with the thought that someone might be watching me every time I left work. The whole situation was unnerving, to say the least. 2 attempts in just 2 weeks. That was too close for comfort. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized how lucky I had been. There could have been 100 different outcomes, and all of them were worse than the one I got. The man in the window, the person hiding behind my car, the feeling of being watched. It all came together to create this constant, gnawing sense of unease. It wasn't just the job anymore. It was a warning. I ended up leaving the job not long after that. Not because I was scared, exactly, but because I had to take a step back and realize that I wasn't going to risk my life for a minimum wage job. The whole experience was a wake-up call. It made me more aware of my surroundings, more cautious, and ultimately, more determined to not let anything like that happen again. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be an easy target. Not now. Not ever again. The job I had at that small business was located on an industrial estate in the middle of nowhere, on an old and disused airfield. The kind of place that, even on a bright sunny day, always felt strangely eerie. The office was tucked away in one of those old, dilapidated buildings that looked like they hadn't been used in years, with the scent of dust and metal always hanging in the air. The business itself was small, so most of the work was done in the mornings, leaving the afternoons pretty quiet. It wasn't unusual to be in the office alone in the afternoons, and that's how it was on that particular day. My colleague had gone out for a meeting, leaving me alone to fend off the time. It was a typical office day. No clients, no deliveries, just the dull hum of the computer and the occasional rustling of papers. The building, despite being in such a remote place, still had some traffic. Delivery drivers often came and went, though mostly just in the mornings, so by the time afternoon rolled around, the whole place went into a strange, uneasy silence. That day, however, I was feeling unusually bored. I'd been working at my desk, staring at the screen for what felt like hours, when I decided to take a break. Nature was calling, so I stood up and made my way to the toilets. Now, the layout of the building was odd. To get to the toilets, you had to go downstairs, take a right at a crossroad, walk through the empty warehouse, and then follow a little loop that brought you to a small, dimly lit hallway with the toilets at the end. The layout was unnecessarily confusing, but it had become second nature after working there for a while. I remember it clearly. I was standing in front of the toilet, minding my own business, when I suddenly heard the front door of the building open and close. My first thought was, oh, it must be my colleague back from their meeting. I wasn't too worried about it because, even if it wasn't them, it could easily be one of the drivers popping in to drop something off. That happened fairly often, especially around this time of day when the place was quiet. I finished up in the bathroom, and as usual, turned to glance out of the small window above the loo to see who had arrived. But when I looked, I was immediately thrown off. The car park was empty. My car was the only one there. No deliveries, no other vehicles, just mine parked up in the far corner. Now that was strange. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that crept up on me. Maybe they'd parked behind the warehouse, or maybe they just didn't drive today. I tried to calm myself with a shrug and went to wash my hands, still not fully comfortable with the situation, but trying not to overthink it. As I washed up, I heard it. The distinct sound of footsteps on the floorboards above my head. The unmistakable creak of someone walking up the stairs. I knew exactly where they were by the sound of each individual step, and I could tell the person was coming up toward the office. The sound was so familiar. After working in the building for so long, you start to know the exact noises each part of the building makes. The stairs above me were creaking louder as the person ascended, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gripped me. I finished washing my hands quickly and dried them, trying to ignore the increasing feeling of dread gnawing at me. I called out, like I normally would, to say hello, expecting to hear a response. "Hey, you back already?" I called, but nothing answered. No footsteps, no voice. I shook my head and started walking back toward the stairs, calling out again, still assuming it was just my colleague, maybe just distracted. But as I made my way through the warehouse and reached the stairs, I was met with complete silence. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the staircase, wondering if I had misheard. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello, is someone there?" Still no response. Just the usual dead quiet of the building. My pulse started to race. Something felt wrong. At this point, I felt a deep unease in my gut. My first instinct was to turn and leave, but the growing tension in the air held me there, frozen in place. I started to ascend the stairs slowly, carefully. The old wood groaned under my weight, and with each step, the silence seemed to grow heavier. My keys were clutched tightly in my hand, my fingers white-knuckled as I tried to focus on the sound of the creaking floorboards above me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The office door was just to my right, the conference room was on my left, both rooms standing as silent and empty as they always were. But there was something wrong. I could feel it. Something was off, and my gut told me that I wasn't alone. There was no reason for anyone to be in the building at this hour, especially with the parking lot still empty. I checked the office. Empty. The door was closed. I turned to the conference room next, glancing at the shut door. I didn't want to open it. Something inside me screamed not to. But I couldn't ignore the fact that there was nowhere else for someone to hide. The conference room was huge, and the door was heavy. There was no way anyone could have sneaked in without me hearing it. My mind raced as I quickly scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. The floorboards had given away someone's movements, but now, there was no sign of anyone. I felt the panic rising in my chest, and for a moment, I debated bolting out of the building and leaving. But I couldn't. My legs carried me towards the conference room door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I pushed it open, ready to face whatever might be lurking inside. As soon as the door creaked open, I flicked the lights on. The room was empty, dark, still. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared into the emptiness of the room. not able to explain what had just happened. I knew what I had heard. The door had opened. The footsteps had been real. But now, there was no one. No sign of anyone. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was suffocating. It was as if the building itself had grown eyes and was staring at me. I backed away from the room, still hearing nothing but the sound of my racing breath. I didn't stay to check further. My mind was whirling, my body reacting before I could think. I hurried down the stairs, heart pounding, almost tripping over my own feet as I rushed outside to the parking lot. Just as I reached the door, I saw my colleague pulling into the lot. I ran to meet him, frantic, explaining everything as quickly as I could. We didn't waste time. We walked together back into the building, checking every room. We even braved the conference room again, searching every inch. Nothing. No sign of anyone, no explanation. The warehouse was empty, the doors locked. The place was as still and lifeless as it always was. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something had entered the building. To this day, I have no explanation. I know what I heard. I know what I felt. The noises weren't caused by wind, and they weren't from the heating system. The floorboards creaked a very specific way when someone was walking, and I knew those sounds by heart. There was no way anyone could have slipped past me unnoticed. If they had, I would have heard it. I would have seen them. And yet, there was no one. No trace. No evidence. Just the strange feeling that someone, or something, had been there. I left that job not long after, though I never told anyone the full extent of what happened that day. There are things that you can't explain, and sometimes it's better not to try. But I know what I heard. And to this day, I can't walk past an old, empty building without remembering the eerie silence of that afternoon and the footsteps that should never have been there. It was a crisp winter evening, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the streets are silent under a blanket of fresh snow. I had just turned 18, freshly out of high school, and was working a closing shift at a small cafe located inside a local grocery store. It was my first job, and while it wasn't glamorous, it kept me busy and gave me a steady paycheck. The customers were mostly the same regulars, familiar faces, and it wasn't too difficult, though I often worked alone during the night shifts, which made things a bit more uncomfortable. Tom was one of the regulars. He was an older man, late 70s or early 80s, I couldn't quite tell. He had this way about him that unsettled me from the moment I started working there. Every time he came in, he'd announce himself with his usual phrase, "Where's my girls?" No one had ever asked him to stop, but it always made me feel awkward. He'd make his rounds, grabbing a coffee and a bagel, and then, no matter who was behind the counter, he'd expect a hug. And it wasn't just a quick hug. Tom was a hugger, and the hugs always lasted a little too long, his hands resting awkwardly on your back as he whispered, "God bless you," in your ear. The first time it happened, I froze, unsure of how to react. But after a few weeks, I started to dread it, though I didn't want to cause a scene. That night, I was working the closing shift alone. It was the kind of shift that felt like it would never end. It was already dark outside by the time Tom walked in at around 4 p.m. His usual smile was plastered on his face, his wife by his side. She was quiet, with tired eyes, and she always seemed a little frail. I didn't mind her company as much, though. She never asked anything strange or made me feel uncomfortable. "Where's my girl tonight?" Tom called out as he stepped inside. I forced a smile, gave him the usual greeting, and quickly took his order, a coffee and a bagel. As I worked, Tom started asking me more personal questions than usual. At first, it was the typical stuff. How's the job going? Do I like working nights? But then the questions shifted. Is it hard closing alone? He asked, leaning over the counter a bit too close for comfort. No, it's not so bad, I replied, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a moment, and I could feel his eyes linger on me in a way that made me uncomfortable. I shifted, trying to focus on the task in front of me, but he wasn't done. "What time do you get off?" he asked, his tone now softer, almost too interested. "I get off at 7, I said, keeping my voice light. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I smiled anyway, hoping he'd leave it at that. His wife, who had been silent up to that point, gave a tired sigh and glanced at her watch. She seemed to be ready to leave, but Tom wasn't done with me. "Do you ever get scared, walking to your car in the dark?" His voice was low, as if he was concerned, but the way he asked made my skin crawl. "I'm fine," I said, forcing the words out, a little too quickly, trying to signal that I wanted the conversation to end. His wife didn't say anything, just stood up and walked toward the door, but Tom stayed behind, his eyes still following me. I went back to work, ignoring him as best as I could. He continued to sit there, sipping his coffee, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me to say something, or maybe do something. I didn't know. Eventually, his wife left without him. She gave him a quiet look as she passed by, but Tom didn't even acknowledge her. I assumed she'd probably had enough of whatever conversation they'd been having. But Tom didn't leave, not for another couple of hours. He just sat there, alone now, and continued to stare at me as I cleaned up the counter and wiped down the tables. At around 6:30 p.m., I asked a little more firmly if there was anything else he needed. "No," he said, smiling, his voice casual. "I'm just waiting for you to get off work." I didn't know how to respond. My stomach dropped a little. This wasn't normal. I was supposed to be finishing up soon, and I didn't want him to keep sitting there, staring at me, waiting for me to finish. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was quieter now. I focused on wiping down the counter, ignoring him as best as I could. The silence was deafening. When it finally hit 7 p.m., I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, ready to punch out. I was more than ready to leave, even though I was still a little on edge. As I walked out into the parking lot, I felt a slight sense of relief. It was just me and the stillness of the Michigan winter. The snow had fallen heavy, covering everything in white. It was beautiful and peaceful in a way that only snow-covered nights could be. I took my snow brush out of the trunk of my car and started clearing off the windshield, the cold air biting at my face. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars in the distance. Everything felt calm, peaceful even. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, taking in the quiet. Then, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was a parking lot after all. People were always walking around, but when I looked over my shoulder, I froze. It was Tom, and he was walking directly toward me. My heart sank into my stomach as he came closer. He had a smile on his face, but it wasn't friendly. It was predatory, almost too calm, too knowing. The air around me felt thick with tension. I tried to ignore the rising panic in my chest, tried to convince myself that it was fine, that he was just being his usual weird self. But then he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. "I've been sitting outside waiting for you," he said, his smile never wavering. "You shouldn't be out here alone. It's dangerous for young girls to be in a parking lot at night." My blood ran cold. I turned back to my car, fumbling to open the door, but it was frozen shut. My fingers were shaking so badly that I could hardly get a grip on the handle. Tom was still coming closer, and I could hear his footsteps crunching through the snow with every step he took. "I don't need help," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. "I'm fine." He stopped about 10 feet away, still smiling at me like he was waiting for something. His smile, though, didn't look like the smile of someone who was just trying to help. It looked like someone who knew they had control of the situation. It made my stomach turn. "Don't you want to be safe?" he asked, his voice turning softer, more insistent. "It's dangerous for a girl like you. You don't want to end up like all those others." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I fumbled in my purse, my hands shaking as I searched for my pepper spray. It was attached to my keys, and I gripped it tightly, hoping that he wouldn't get any closer. "Stay back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have pepper spray. Stay back, Tom." For a moment, there was silence. He just stared at me, his smile slipping into something more menacing. Then, as if he couldn't care less, he muttered, "You're just a stupid girl, aren't you?" Without warning, he spat at me, the slimy droplet hitting the ground just inches from my feet. My stomach lurched, and I nearly gagged, but I didn't move. I kept my eyes on him, my hands still gripping the pepper spray. Without another word, Tom turned around and shuffled back toward the store, his footsteps crunching in the snow as he left. I didn't move until I was sure he was gone, and then I rushed into my car, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine, my mind racing. I drove home in a haze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whole drive, I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally got home, I called the store to report it. I didn't want to just let it slide. They told me they would handle it. The next day, they kicked Tom out of the store and told him never to come back. I could hear the anger in the manager's voice as he told me that Tom had been cursing up a storm, demanding to be let back in, but they didn't let him. His wife had to come pick him up. A couple of years later, I heard that Tom was arrested for child pornography. I don't know all the details, and to be honest, I didn't want to know. But part of me felt relieved, knowing that I wasn't the only one who had felt something was wrong about him. I never went back to that store, and I never saw him again. And I'm not sad about that. I'll never forget the feeling of his eyes on me that night, and I'll never forget the sense of danger that came with it. Sometimes, when I think back on it, I wonder if something worse could have happened. But I remind myself that I did the right thing. I stood my ground. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with 2 roommates, Luke and Jen. The kind of place where everything felt picture perfect on the surface. It was a planned development, so it had all these little community perks. A pool, a park, a garden, and even a walking trail around the perimeter. It seemed like the ideal spot to settle down after long days at work. But there was one downside. The local bus stopped running at around 8 p.m. I worked graveyard shifts at a nearby warehouse, so it wasn't much of a problem for me. My schedule was all over the place, sometimes starting at 10 p.m., other times finishing by 6 a.m. Luke, though, worked nights at a restaurant. His shift didn't end until about 10 p.m., and after that, he had to catch the city bus to get back home, which could take up to an hour. That bus stop was a good 10 miles from our house, and walking from there late at night wasn't the safest. I offered to help him out, telling him that if he covered some of my utility share, I'd pick him up after work. It worked out well for both of us. Jen, who worked odd hours as a barista, often tagged along. Sometimes, we'd go grab a late-night snack on the way back from the bus stop, just the 3 of us. It became a routine, nothing out of the ordinary. One night, though, everything changed. I was asleep in my room, sprawled out on my bed after another long shift. I had finally drifted off, the heavy silence of the house wrapping around me, when I heard it. It started as a faint sound, like someone was calling my name. Walkie. Walkie. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper. I was half asleep, so at first I thought I was dreaming. But then it came again, this time louder. Walkie. Walkie. I shot up in bed, the fog of sleep lifting instantly. It was Jen's voice. What the hell? She never called me that late. I glanced at my phone. 2 a.m. I rubbed my face, still disoriented, and scrambled out of bed. My first thought was that I had missed Luke's text, that we were late to pick him up from the bus stop. Maybe Jen was just standing out front, waiting for me to get my act together. I had to move fast. I didn't want to keep them waiting. I threw on a jacket, grabbed the keys off my desk, and headed downstairs. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge and the creak of the old wooden floors beneath my feet. I opened the garage door, expecting to see Jen standing in the driveway, pacing or something, but there was no sign of her. No Jen, no Luke, nothing. I stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the driveway. My eyes fell on my car, nothing else. There was no sign of Jen standing there under the streetlights, her short frame clearly visible in the glow. The driveway was empty. Maybe she had gone out front for a smoke, even though I knew she hated it when I smoked. Still, I figured it was worth a check. I was about to step outside, but then I realized something, my phone. I had left it upstairs. I sighed, irritated with myself. It was too late to go looking for her out there without a phone. If she was outside, she could get back in without any trouble. I closed the garage and walked back inside. As I went up the stairs, I noticed that the lights were on in both Jen and Luke's rooms. Odd. I paused for a moment, standing at the top of the staircase, listening to the quiet. Both of them were home. If Jen had been calling my name, why wasn't she in her room? I felt a strange unease creeping up my spine. I'd seen her door shut earlier, and I knew she had been home long before I fell asleep. I pushed the door to my room open and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The time read 2:05 a.m. Still no texts, no calls. Just the standard notifications from work and an unread email. That was when I felt the weirdness set in, something I couldn't shake. Jen had never called my name like that before. It wasn't like her to do something so strange. We hadn't even talked about anything weird recently. I thought back to when I'd opened the garage earlier. Had I heard footsteps? Had I seen shadows? No, everything had been eerily still. Just that voice, Jen's voice, calling me. I sent her a quick text, asking if she was awake, then set the phone down on my desk. I wasn't sure what to think anymore. It all felt off. Too many little things didn't add up. I decided to check on Luke. Maybe he had gone to bed after his shift and somehow missed me trying to get his attention. I knocked on his door, but there was no response. It was quiet inside. I hesitated for a second and then opened the door. The light was on. The room was empty though, except for his cluttered bed and a few clothes scattered around the floor. No sign of him either. I texted Jen again. "Hey, what's up? You called my name." A few minutes passed. No response. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet hitting the cool floor. There was something in the air, a feeling I couldn't explain, like something wasn't quite right. I glanced over at Jen's door, which was still shut. I knocked, softly at first, then louder when I didn't hear any movement. Still nothing. My heart began to beat faster. Maybe they were just asleep, but it was strange. The timing, the way Jen's voice had sounded, calling for me so urgently. I opened the door. Jen's bed was empty, the blankets tossed carelessly across the mattress. No Jen. That's when I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I hadn't seen her since I first heard her calling my name outside, and now her room was empty. Both rooms, Luke's and Jen's, were completely untouched. I stood there for a long time, my thoughts racing. What had happened? Where were they? I walked back downstairs, a pit forming in my stomach. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. It was, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Then it hit me. Jen had never been outside calling my name. I had never heard her voice. I had been hearing something, yes, but it wasn't her. It couldn't have been. That realization made the hair on my arms stand up. My mind raced through the events of the night. Jen's voice, Luke not answering his door, the eerie quiet of the house. And then the worst thought crossed my mind. What if someone had been standing outside in the dark, imitating her voice? I immediately grabbed my phone and checked the security cameras around the house. I couldn't see much from the view in the garage, but there was something odd about the footage from just before I'd gotten up. It was blurry, hard to make out. I checked the footage from earlier in the night when I had gone to bed. At around 1:30 a.m., something was moving across the front yard. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a shadow, a figure creeping across the driveway. A person. Someone who was too careful to be caught on camera fully? I didn't know. But that chill in my bones told me that whoever it was had been very deliberate, had waited until I was deep asleep to start making those noises. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I just kept staring at the footage, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. The silence was deafening. Around 3 a.m., I heard a car pull up outside. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the window, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain all of this. When I saw the headlights, I immediately recognized the car. It was Jen's. Jen. She stepped out, her tired eyes wide as she looked up at the house. Her face was pale, like she hadn't slept in days. She was staring right at the window, as if she knew I was watching her. I rushed downstairs to open the door, but by the time I got there, she had disappeared into the night, leaving me alone in the quiet. She never came back inside that night. I had always considered myself a street-smart kid. Growing up, I had a lot of freedom, especially in the neighborhood I lived in. My friends and I would often wander, go to the park, or ride our bikes down to the shops without much thought of danger. That sense of security was probably what led me to not think twice when I decided to cycle to the park that day. I was 13 or 14, a bit more independent than most kids my age, and this was one of the first times I had decided to ride my bike all the way to the park by myself. I was used to the area, so it didn't seem like a big deal. The park was a good 20-minute ride, but the route was something I knew well. It wasn't anything special, just a basic park near the local shops, with a decent basketball court and some swings, where most of us hung out after school or on weekends. It was also kind of in the middle of the neighborhood, so nothing really felt out of place. I remember setting off on my bike, feeling a bit of that excitement that came with being alone, that feeling of freedom. The sun was still high in the sky, but the trees lining the path through the cut-through between the houses made everything feel a bit more shaded. It wasn't particularly dark, but it did feel secluded, which added a certain quietness to the air. The path itself wasn't much more than a narrow strip of pavement that cut through a row of trees and bushes, leading from one side of the neighborhood to the park. It was a pedestrian path, so there wasn't much traffic, and even fewer people actually walked through there. I didn't mind the isolation. I figured it was just a shortcut, a place that was usually calm and peaceful. As I cycled through the path, I noticed a guy standing to the side, pulling on a low-hanging branch. It didn't seem odd at first. People did weird stuff all the time in public, right? Sometimes they just stood around or acted strange, but I didn't think anything of it. I was focused on getting to the park. I hadn't seen him when I first started down the path, but when I came closer, it registered. He was wearing a blue tracksuit, something that looked like it could be a local football team kit, although I didn't recognize it. It wasn't until I passed him that I noticed his sudden movement. He lurched forward, and before I could even process it, I saw the branch in his hand swing toward my front tire. He didn't exactly throw it at me, but he made a quick, deliberate motion to poke the branch through my wheel. The tire didn't get stuck, but the suddenness of it made my heart skip. I yanked the handlebars hard to the left, swerving to avoid it. I could hear the sound of the branch scraping the air as I just managed to avoid the impact. My body tensed, and my adrenaline surged. I glanced back, but by then, he was already standing still, just watching me. I didn't stop to make sense of it. I pushed my bike harder, cycling as fast as I could, the sound of my tires spinning loudly in my ears. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I raced toward the park. The wind rushed past my face, and my thoughts were jumbled. What had just happened? Why had he done that? But I knew I had to get away, and fast. I pushed myself, not stopping for anything, not daring to look back. The park came into view as I rounded the corner, and I almost felt a sense of relief as I saw my friends waiting near the swings. I skidded to a stop, my tires squealing against the pavement. I barely had time to catch my breath before I started telling them what had just happened. My words tumbled out quickly, and my hands were shaking as I explained how the guy had tried to mess with me. "Wait, what guy?" one of my friends asked. "What did he look like?" I told her what I had seen. Blue tracksuit football kit, standing by the trees, then rushing at me with that branch. She looked over my shoulder, her eyes scanning the park behind me, and her face went pale. "Kind of like that guy?" she asked, pointing. I turned around, and my stomach dropped. There, sitting on a bench near the far side of the park, was the same man. He was just sitting there, watching us, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he'd been there for a while. My mind couldn't process it. How had he gotten to the park so quickly? I had been on a bike, going pretty fast, and he had been walking. How had he made it here before me? And why was he sitting there now, staring at us? I was frozen for a moment, my mouth dry, unable to fully comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't just a coincidence. I knew it wasn't. I could feel my heart rate spiking again, and my body tensed. It was like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Without saying a word, I grabbed my bike, and we all started running. We didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on us as we raced toward the nearby street, heading straight for the house of one of my friends. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All I wanted was to get away, to get somewhere safe. We didn't stop until we were inside her house, panting and out of breath. Her parents weren't home, but we locked the doors and stayed inside, away from the windows. My dad showed up not long after to pick me up. I could see the concern on his face as he helped me load my bike into the car, but I didn't say much. I didn't need to. He knew something was off. We drove home in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging over me like a dark cloud. The fact that I had seen that man again, the way he had somehow appeared so quickly, was enough to rattle me to my core. Over the next few years, the memory of that day lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was only when I was walking around town a few years later that I thought I saw him again. The same guy, dressed in a blue tracksuit, walking down the street near where I lived. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but something about the way he looked at me sent that same chill down my spine. He didn't do anything that time, but I didn't stick around to see if he would. I quickly turned and walked in the opposite direction, my heart pounding once again. I don't know what that guy wanted, or why he had acted the way he did. I don't know if he had been following me, or if it was all some twisted coincidence. But the fact that he had appeared at the park when I had just gotten there, after trying to mess with me earlier, felt too deliberate. It was one of those things that left me with more questions than answers. And it still creeps me out, thinking about how close I came to something worse happening. Maybe he wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe it was all just a weird, twisted prank, but I'll never be sure. It's been years now, but that day has stuck with me. Whenever I pass that park, I always get a sense of unease, like something about it is wrong. Even now, I can't look at a blue tracksuit without feeling that same knot in my stomach. I wonder if I'll ever run into him again, if he's still out there, lurking in the shadows. I don't want to know. I've learned to trust my instincts more than ever since that day. You never know when something strange or dangerous might happen, and when it does, you can't always outrun it. The vacation to Hawaii had been a long time coming. My family and I were all excited about it, especially my mom. She had this whole itinerary planned out, wanting to see all the tourist spots and experience everything the island had to offer. But of course, she wasn't satisfied with just the usual stuff. The one thing she was especially set on was driving the road to Hana. Most people take a tour bus, but not my mom. She wanted to rent a car and do it herself. The rental companies typically discourage driving on that road because it's narrow, winding, and dangerous. But that didn't stop her. She was determined, and after some convincing, my dad reluctantly agreed to let her take the wheel. We started the drive early in the morning, excited to see the views and explore the island. The road to Hana is famous for its beauty, lush forests, waterfalls, and cliffs that drop straight into the ocean. We stopped several times, taking in the sights, snapping pictures, and getting out to stretch our legs. By the time the sun started to set, we had already been on the road for hours. It was peaceful, beautiful, and the perfect kind of day. By the time the day had fully slipped into night, we were nowhere near civilization. The winding roads had become even narrower, and we were deep into the backcountry of Maui, far away from the touristy areas. My mom wasn't ready to turn back just yet. The night was clear, the sky dotted with stars, and the air was warm and calm. She suggested we take some photos of the moon and the ocean. So we drove down a smaller, even more remote road that seemed to go deeper into the wilderness. There were no signs, no lights, nothing that indicated any kind of development or people for miles. It felt like we were the only ones left on the entire island. As we drove, the road twisted even more, hugging the edges of steep cliffs that dropped straight down into the ocean. There were no guardrails, just a narrow strip of tarmac, barely wide enough for our car. At some points, you couldn't even pull over without risking falling off the edge of the road. It was the kind of place where you felt very small and insignificant. We were isolated, alone, and yet that's exactly what my mom wanted, the ultimate experience of being in nature. We came upon a bend in the road, and it was the kind of place that made you stop and take notice. A sharp turn where the road dropped away on one side and a thick forest lined the other. Just beyond that, a small waterfall spilled down the rocks into a deep pool, and beyond that, the land dropped off into the ocean. The moonlight made everything look like something out of a dream, casting silver reflections on the water and the trees. My mom was thrilled. She immediately pulled the car over to the side of the road. It was tight, and there was barely enough room to get out, but we managed. I could tell she was excited to take some pictures in the moonlight. The silence around us was profound, almost eerie. It was so still that I couldn't even hear the usual sounds of insects or animals that you'd expect at night. The forest was dead silent. I stepped out of the car with her, looking around, and I was taken aback by how quiet it was. It felt like the whole world had gone to sleep. We stood there for a while, taking in the scenery. My mom was adjusting her camera, trying to get the perfect shot of the ocean under the stars. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound at first. It was almost like a whimper. I froze, my heart starting to beat faster. It didn't make sense. There was no one around, and we hadn't seen another person for hours. No one should be out here in the middle of nowhere, especially at night. At first, I thought it might be a dog, maybe a stray. But as I listened more closely, it became clear it wasn't a dog. It sounded like a baby crying, a soft, pitiful wail carried on the wind. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, trying to locate where the sound was coming from. But the trees were dense, and the area was so remote that I couldn't even fathom how a baby would end up here. The crying was faint but unmistakable. It stopped abruptly, and I stood there, my stomach twisting with unease. "Mom," I called quietly. "Did you hear that?" She didn't seem to hear me. She was still busy with her camera, fiddling with the lens. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on me. I called to her again, but she shook her head, saying she hadn't heard anything. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Maybe I was just imagining things, I thought. It wasn't unusual for my mind to play tricks on me, especially in such a quiet and isolated place. I tried to shake it off, but then out of nowhere, the crying started again. This time, it was louder, more distinct, and I couldn't ignore it. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, but it was so muffled that I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. The wailing echoed through the night, and I could feel my anxiety rising. It wasn't natural. Something about it didn't sit right. "Mom," I said, a little more urgently now. "We need to go." She looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" "I keep hearing a baby crying," I said, trying to explain, but I felt ridiculous saying it out loud. A baby crying in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. But I had heard it. I was sure of it. She didn't seem convinced. "You're probably just hearing things. Let's get some pictures before we go back to the hotel." But I couldn't let it go. The crying continued, off in the distance, and I couldn't help but feel that there was something incredibly wrong. It wasn't a normal sound. It was too faint, too far away, and the fact that we hadn't seen anyone for so long made it all the more eerie. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that we were being watched. We both stood there, listening to the sound, trying to figure out what to do. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and every time the crying stopped, I felt like it was going to start up again at any moment. It was almost like it was coming from all around us, echoing off the trees, bouncing off the cliffs. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a tightness in my throat. This wasn't just some lost animal. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something was out there. We spent what felt like an eternity standing there in the cold, tense silence. Each time the crying stopped, we would stand, holding our breath, waiting. And each time, it would start up again, a little louder, a little more insistent. I don't know how long it went on like that. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. All I knew was that I was terrified. Eventually, the crying stopped altogether. We didn't speak. There was nothing more to say. The night fell back into its eerie stillness, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over me, though it was quickly followed by a deep unease. The moment was over, but it wasn't something I could forget. I just wanted to leave. My mom, finally sensing my discomfort, agreed that it was time to go. We got back in the car and drove away, the narrow road winding its way back through the darkness. I didn't say anything more about it. I didn't have to. The whole experience had shaken me to my core, and I wasn't sure if I could ever explain it to anyone. I don't think I even fully understood what had happened myself. When we finally got back to the hotel, I thought maybe I would feel better. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, listening to us. That sound of a baby crying in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, stuck with me. I never mentioned it again. My mom never brought it up either. It was just one of those things we didn't talk about. And as far as I know, no one else heard it. But I'll never forget the feeling, that sense of isolation and dread, and the sound of that crying that I couldn't explain. After that night, we finished our vacation like normal. We did some more sightseeing, and we even went to the beach. But every time I thought back to that night on the road to Hannah, I couldn't help but feel that there was something we didn't understand about that place. Something that didn't make sense. And no matter how much time passes, I still wonder what we heard that night, and whether we were truly alone out there on the edge of that island. I was on a solo motorcycle trip across the great USA. I had dreamed of doing it for years, and finally, in the fall of 2015, I made it happen. From New York, I rode south to Florida, taking in the sights, the people, the small towns that seemed to slip by in a blur. Then I made my way west, cutting across the country, heading for Los Angeles. Along the way, I found my peace in the open road. The wind in my face, the hum of the engine beneath me, the occasional stop at a national park to rest. It was everything I had ever wanted. But it wasn't all easy. I crashed once, doing 80 miles per hour on a stretch of highway in Texas, skidding along the pavement and narrowly missing a guardrail. That was a wake-up call. Then in New Orleans, things got real sketchy. I was grabbing a bite at a local diner when gunshots rang out from the alley behind. I bolted, heart pounding, feeling the hot breath of danger on my neck. That wasn't even the worst part, though. It was a guy in a small town outside of Baton Rouge, hyped up on crystal meth, who tried to pick a fight with me for no reason. A man could snap at any moment like that. But none of those things got under my skin quite like that night in Louisiana. It was Thanksgiving night, 2015. I'd been on the road for almost a month, and I was ready to just stop for a night, settle down somewhere quiet. I had spent most of my days in national parks, where you could camp out under the stars without worry. But tonight, I wasn't in a park. I had stopped by a small local market in a town near a few woods, a place where the locals seemed friendly enough. I was carrying a small bag of food, some turkey, a little stuffing, nothing fancy. When I walked out of the store, there was a man and his young son standing near a rusty pickup truck. They noticed my motorcycle and struck up a conversation, which, to be honest, I didn't mind. It was always nice to chat with folks along the road, especially when you're traveling solo. But then, the conversation took a turn. The father, mid-40s, with graying hair and a tired look about him, asked me where I was staying for the night. I told him I'd found a small camping spot about a mile out, tucked in some trees. The moment I said it, his face went pale. He leaned in, dropped his voice, and told me in a low, almost frantic whisper, "You don't want to go there." It threw me off. I laughed it off, assuming he was just being overly cautious, but he wasn't joking. He insisted again, almost pleading with me. "There's a group, people who practice dark arts in those woods, especially around Thanksgiving. They've been known to take people, just vanish them. Don't go there, please." I tried to brush it off as superstition, something that you hear in small towns where people have a little too much time on their hands and make up stories to pass the time. But I couldn't ignore the sincerity in his eyes, the worry in his voice. Still, the sun was beginning to set, and I had no other options. The night was closing in fast, and my body was sore from riding all day. I promised him I'd keep an eye out, but ultimately, I made up my mind. I was going. There wasn't really another choice. I waved him off, thanked him for the advice, and jumped back on the bike, heading toward the camp spot. When I got there, it was quieter than I had expected. No other campers around, just a few old RVs parked nearby. Some were clean and well kept, while others looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A few had camping chairs and leftover cans scattered around them, like they'd been used recently, but now sat abandoned. The entire place felt like it was stuck between two worlds, half used and half forgotten. The trees stood tall and close, their shadows creeping along the ground as the sun dipped lower. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the place, but I shrugged it off. I lit a fire, set up my tent, and pulled out my food. I was determined to enjoy my Thanksgiving meal, no matter how strange the place felt. The turkey came out of a bag, nothing special, but it was warm and filling. As I ate, I could feel the weight of the road in my muscles, the tension in my shoulders, the ache in my back. I was exhausted, but something about the campsite wasn't sitting right with me. It wasn't the people, the RVs, the quiet, but it was a sense of being watched. Maybe it was the way the place felt so abandoned, or the odd way the few items left out had that feeling of being left behind in a hurry. The woods around me were eerily silent, like they were holding their breath. It was as if the trees themselves were waiting for something to happen, and I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I decided to push through it. Motorcycle trips like mine weren't meant for luxury. I was used to solitude, to the quiet of the wilderness, and I figured the feeling would pass once I got some rest. So I let the fire die down and crawled into my tent, hoping the cool air would calm my nerves. That's when it happened. I was just settling in, trying to find that sweet spot between being too hot and too cold inside the tent, when I heard it. A noise that stopped my heart in my chest. It was the most horrific sound I'd ever heard, unlike anything I could describe. It was a mixture of a human scream, but it was warped, like something dying, something twisted. It was one sharp, guttural sound that seemed to cut through the air, and yet it felt both distant and close at the same time. It was the kind of scream that makes your entire body freeze in terror, the kind you feel in your bones, not just your ears. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed. The sound echoed around the woods, bouncing off the trees, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, that same horrible scream, and it was even worse than the first. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out of the tent, my heart racing, my breath shallow. I shined the light into the woods, my hands shaking as I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. It was too quiet again. The kind of silence that makes you think the world has stopped. My body screamed at me to run, but my mind was stuck, caught in that primal instinct to search for the danger, to find out what had caused that awful noise. I picked up a rock, gripping it in my hand, and began to move slowly around the camp, stepping carefully through the underbrush. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees feeling like watching eyes, the shadows swallowing the light of my flashlight. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I kept moving. I don't know why I thought I could find something, but I had to prove that I wasn't just imagining it, that I wasn't losing my mind. I circled the area, searching the dark, but there was nothing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and that was all. Just that deep, unsettling silence again. I walked around for what felt like hours, but I knew better than to go too deep into the woods at night. I was alone. No one knew where I was, and no one had heard that scream but me. I finally gave up, exhausted both physically and mentally, and returned to my tent. I didn't sleep that night. The feeling of being watched, the echo of that scream, stayed with me. I kept hearing it in my head, over and over, like a broken record. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woods, I heard the scream. I couldn't escape it, and still no one else came. No one appeared from the RVs. No one ventured out into the woods. I never found out what made that sound. I never found out who or what it was. I have my theories, of course. Maybe it was some animal, maybe a coyote or something else in the night, but it didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like anything I had ever heard before. It felt wrong. In the morning, I packed up quickly, my nerves fried and my body sore. I didn't want to stay a second longer. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I still don't know what happened that night, and part of me never will. But I know one thing, I'll never forget that scream. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural stuff. Never have. But I do have a story, and it's not dramatic at all, but at the time, I was more freaked out than I care to admit. Confused, too. I'll tell you about it, but I'm not claiming there's some haunting or paranormal explanation. Just an experience that doesn't quite add up. A few years ago, I was at Beverly Beach State Park in Newport, Oregon. It's a nice spot, near the beach with a forested area that leads down to a creek. I was there with my dog, walking along a trail that runs pretty close to the creek on one side and a steep hill filled with brush and trees on the other. I could still see the campground from where I was, with the RVs and tents poking through the trees on the other side of the creek. It was a late afternoon, and the weather was nice enough. The forest was still pretty dense in some areas, but the trail was wide enough for me and my dog to walk comfortably without getting caught in too much underbrush. My dog, a big goofy golden retriever, had always been friendly with everyone. He was the kind of dog that made friends everywhere we went, whether it was people, other dogs, or even the occasional curious squirrel. We'd walked this trail 100 times, and it was one of our favorite spots. I'd always felt pretty safe there, even though it could get kind of quiet. But on this day, as I walked along the path, something felt off. I don't know how to describe it, just a weird feeling in the air, like something wasn't right. It didn't feel dangerous, exactly, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. We were about 10 minutes into the walk when I saw him. A kid, probably about my age, maybe 14 or so, walking alone down the trail in the opposite direction. I hadn't seen anyone else around for a while, so it kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't one to start conversations with strangers, especially in the middle of the woods, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to wave or say hello. I was feeling a bit lonely, to be honest. I didn't know anyone there, and I was kind of just passing time. I gave my dog's leash a little tug to get his attention, and we started walking toward the kid. But as we got closer, something weird happened. My dog, who had been happily trotting along, suddenly started acting strange. His hackles shot up, and he began barking like crazy, panic barking, not the usual friendly greeting he gave people. His teeth were bared, his tail was tucked between his legs, and he was pulling so hard on his leash that I could barely hold him back. He wasn't trying to be aggressive, but it was clear he was terrified. I had never seen him act like this before, and I had no idea what was going on. I stopped, tugging on his leash with all my strength, trying to calm him down, but it was like he was completely fixated on the kid. His body was rigid, and he was growling in a way I had never heard before. I tried to coax him forward, but he refused to take another step. It was like there was an invisible barrier between him and this kid. Something was scaring him, something that I couldn't see. At that point, I didn't know what to think. I figured maybe the kid had a dog of his own, or something about him was triggering my dog's fear. But that didn't make sense. My dog had met plenty of strangers before, and he wasn't afraid of them. He was just scared of this kid, and it didn't seem like it was for any good reason. I tried to drag him past, giving the kid a wide berth, hoping to get away from whatever was unsettling my dog. I muttered an apology to the kid as I passed him, not expecting much of a response. But instead of the kid saying anything, he just stared at me. It wasn't a normal kind of look. It was slow, deliberate, like he was watching us in a way that felt off. His head turned, tracking us as we moved past, and his gaze never left us. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like he wasn't just looking at us. He was observing us, like he was studying us from some faraway place in his head. The whole thing felt like something out of a horror movie. I'm not a big fan of those, but I've seen enough to know when something feels wrong. The moment we were past him, my dog instantly relaxed. He stopped barking, his tail wagged, and he looked back up at me like nothing had happened. It was like a switch had been flipped. No fear, no tension. He was back to his usual, happy self. I was still trying to make sense of what had just happened when something pulled me to turn around and look back. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to understand what had scared my dog so much. Or maybe I was curious about the kid. Maybe it was a combination of both. But I turned around and started walking back toward the kid, keeping an eye out. I wasn't too far away, maybe 50 feet, but I had to know if he was still there. I thought maybe he had just been a little shy of dogs, or maybe he had some kind of strange reaction to us. But when I looked back, the kid was gone. I don't mean he had walked off, or that I missed him somehow. I mean he was completely gone. There was no sign of him. No sound of footsteps or rustling bushes. No nothing. The trail was long and straight, and the area was pretty open, so it would have been impossible for him to disappear without me noticing. He couldn't have hidden behind a tree. There weren't any close enough, and he certainly wouldn't have been able to run fast enough to disappear from my sight in that short amount of time. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no way he could have just vanished. The creek was on one side, and the steep hill was on the other. There wasn't much to hide behind. It didn't add up. I thought maybe he had ducked down into the creek or hidden behind the bushes on the hillside, but there was no noise, no sign of him moving at all. I glanced around one more time, hoping for a glimpse of him. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Nothing. I turned back around, feeling more confused than scared. I figured he had probably just left the trail and gone up the hill or down by the creek. Maybe he was as freaked out by me and my dog as we were by him. I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was more to the situation than I could explain. I kept walking for a few minutes, trying to shake it off, but the whole thing kept bugging me. It didn't make sense. It didn't feel right. It felt like there was something I was missing, something important. I eventually made it back to the campground, and by then, my dog was back to being his usual self. He was wagging his tail and sniffing around, happily greeting other people. But I couldn't forget the look in that kid's eyes, the way he stared at me as we passed, the way my dog had reacted, the way he was just gone. Maybe it was just a shy kid who didn't want to be around a dog. Maybe he took off and hid for some reason. Or maybe he was just some random stranger out there enjoying the trail, and I happened to walk into his path at the wrong moment. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something about it wasn't normal. Something didn't add up. I told the story to some people back at camp, and some of them thought it was creepy, but most just brushed it off. The ones who seemed the most interested were the ones who believed in ghosts. They were convinced my dog had sensed an evil spirit, that the kid was some kind of ghost or something. They said that was why he had reacted the way he did. But I didn't buy into any of that. I wasn't convinced. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but I couldn't explain it either. It wasn't like any experience I'd ever had before. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I think about it, I'm left with that strange feeling, that sense that something was just a little bit off that day. It's a memory I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Not knowing, not having an explanation. Just that weird feeling of something not quite right that stays with you, even after everything is over. I used to work late shifts at a restaurant, mostly closing down the kitchen, wiping down the counters, mopping floors, and making sure everything was good to go for the morning crew. The place was in the city center, busy during the day but quieter after dark. I usually clocked out around midnight, sometimes a bit later if things ran over or if someone didn't show up and I had to help out. It wasn't a bad job. Decent pay, good coworkers. I didn't mind staying late. The quiet that came after the rush was actually something I liked. Just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the city settling down for the night. I always rode my bike to and from work. I didn't own a car back then. I was in my early 20s, just trying to save money. Plus, I liked the ride. It gave me time to think, to let go of the day. The route home took about 15 minutes, maybe a bit more if I was tired or the weather was bad. It followed a bike trail that ran parallel to the train tracks. The trail was almost completely straight, a long stretch with a few bends but no real curves. There were exits here and there, little ramps that led off into different parts of the suburbs. But for the most part, it was just the trail and the tracks. There weren't many street lights along it. A few spaced out far from each other, just enough to make you wish there were more. If my front bike light ever died, I'd be riding blind through long patches of complete darkness. That thought alone used to make me nervous, so I always made sure to charge my light before work. Always. No exceptions. That night, I left around 12:15. It had been a normal shift. Nothing too crazy, just a busy Friday night crowd that lingered longer than they should have. I changed out of my uniform, packed up my things, and stepped outside into the cool air. It wasn't cold, just a little chilly, like the city couldn't decide if it was still summer or fall. I clicked my helmet into place, strapped my bag to the back rack, turned on my light, and started pedaling. At first, everything felt normal. The streets were emptying out. A few cars passed here and there, the sound of their tires echoing off the buildings. The occasional person on the sidewalk heading home from a bar or walking their dog. The trail entrance was only about 3 blocks from the restaurant, so I got there pretty quick. I remember coasting down the little slope onto the trail and feeling the darkness close in. The kind of dark that makes your pupils open all the way, trying to catch even the smallest hint of light. I was maybe 2 minutes in when I noticed the sound of tires behind me. Soft, smooth, rhythmic. Another bike. It didn't surprise me too much. This was a popular trail even at night, and the city was considered safe. I didn't get the creeps right away or anything. Sometimes other restaurant workers took the same way home, especially if they lived in the surrounding neighborhoods. But what made me look over my shoulder was that the bike behind me had no lights. No front, no rear. Just the soft whisper of tires on asphalt. I didn't slow down right away. I just glanced back, trying to see if I could make out who it was. But it was too dark. My own light lit up the trail ahead of me, but it didn't reach behind. I couldn't see a face, or even much of a silhouette. Just the faintest suggestion of a figure moving in sync with me. I kept riding. I figured it was just someone whose light died, or who forgot it. It happens. I've done it. I tried to shake off the unease, but I couldn't help glancing back every minute or so. The exits came up, first one, then another. Each time I thought, maybe this guy will peel off and head his own way. But he didn't. He stayed behind me, not close, not far. Just there, matching my pace like we were on some invisible leash together. I told myself I was probably just tired. It had been a long shift, and the night always makes things feel weirder than they are. But still, something in my stomach started to twist, like my instincts were picking up on something my brain wasn't ready to accept yet. I figured if he wanted to pass, he would. The trail was wide enough for 2 bikes easily, with plenty of room. So I slowed down, gradually, not in a sudden way. Just enough that he could get around me if he wanted. But he didn't. He slowed down too. That was the moment I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just tiredness or nerves anymore. This was something else. My heart started to pick up speed. I didn't want to panic. I didn't want to overreact. But there was no reason, none at all, for someone to do that. To mirror me like that. I kept pedaling, trying to think. I had a few minutes left before I'd reach the area near my apartment. I lived in a quiet part of town, the kind of place where all the houses look the same and everyone's asleep by 10. Normally, I'd be glad to be almost home. But not now. I didn't want him knowing where I lived. I didn't want to pull into my building and have him know which door I walked into. I didn't even want him seeing what part of town I was from. So I made a decision. I passed my usual exit and took the next one. It led into a different section of the neighborhood, one I didn't know all that well, but it was close enough that I wouldn't get lost. I started weaving through the streets, taking random turns. Left, right, left again. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to be unpredictable. He followed. Every turn I took, he took. Every time I tried to speed up, he matched me. He never got closer, never further. Just stayed back there like a shadow. I felt my chest tightening with every block. The lights were fewer here, mostly porch lights or dim street lamps that flickered. The houses were dark, silent. No one was awake. It felt like the whole world had gone to sleep and left me alone with this stranger. I started to wonder if I should stop and bang on someone's door, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road, and I didn't want to stop moving. I turned again, and ahead I saw one of those narrow bike paths, the kind that cuts between two rows of houses. It was even darker than the trail had been. No lights at all, just a black tunnel between fences and hedges. I knew if I went down there, he'd follow, and I'd have no way out except forward. It was a trap, basically. I couldn't go through it, so I didn't. At the last second, I swerved into one of the driveways. The garage was closed, but there was a little shadowed spot just beside it, tucked between a bush and the corner of the house. I ditched my bike in the grass and crouched there, pulling my hoodie over my head, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. My breath was loud in my ears, but I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep quiet. A few seconds later, I heard the soft whir of his tires. He slowed down. Then I heard the brakes squeak slightly, right at the edge of the bike path. He was looking for me. I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe a full minute. It felt like forever. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was terrified he'd come back and start checking houses, or that he saw me and was just pretending to wait. But eventually I heard it. The tires again, rolling forward. Slowly at first, then picking up speed as he coasted down the path. The sound faded into the distance. I waited a little longer, just to be sure. Then I grabbed my bike, crept back to the street, and rolled slowly to the corner. I stopped right at the edge and looked down the path. I couldn't see much, just blackness, but I could tell he was far enough now that I had a window. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was anger or stubbornness. But I rolled out into the street and rode back toward the path. I stopped right at the top of it and stared. I couldn't see his face. I couldn't see much of anything. But I knew he was there, somewhere down that path. I knew he could feel me watching. I wanted him to know that I saw him, that I wasn't going to just be a victim. I stayed for just a few seconds. Then I turned and rode away as fast as I could. I took a longer route home, looping through side streets, checking over my shoulder constantly. I didn't head straight back. I kept moving, zigzagging through the neighborhood, until I was sure no one was following me. When I finally got to my building, I rode around it once before locking my bike up and going inside. I kept all the lights off in my apartment that night, sat on the floor by the window with the kitchen knife in my lap, just in case. I barely slept. I never saw him again. I took different routes after that, changed my schedule when I could, even looked into taking the bus. Nothing like that ever happened again. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just weird. But I trust my gut, and that night, every part of me knew something was wrong. I'm glad I'll never know the truth. Some things are better left unknown. It was the kind of night that made the streets feel like they belonged to no one. The streetlights were dim, their faint glow barely cutting through the thick darkness. I worked the graveyard shift, and I was used to the quiet. The gas station was closed except for the pump that lit up like a lonely island in the middle of nowhere. The only sound was the hum of the pump and the occasional rustle of leaves from a breeze that couldn't decide whether it wanted to blow or not. I just finished with a long shift, and the last thing I wanted was to stop for gas, but my car was running low. The place was deserted. Not a soul in sight. The thought crossed my mind that I shouldn't be doing this. Pumping gas in the middle of the night when the streets were pitch black, when the night seemed too still, but I didn't have much of a choice. I wasn't too far from home, and I figured it'd be quick. I slid out of the car, keeping an eye on the dark parking lot. The station had been closed for an hour now, and there was no sign of anyone around. The place was eerily quiet. A few cars passed by on the main road, but they didn't stop, and I found myself wishing they would. Wishing for something familiar, something that made the world feel less like it was spinning out of control. I went through the motions of fueling up, focusing on the task at hand. That's when I saw him. He appeared out of nowhere, as if the night had just spat him out. A tall guy about my height, maybe a little taller. I didn't notice him at first, just saw a shadow moving in my peripheral vision. When I glanced up, he was walking toward me, his footsteps silent on the pavement. The streetlights barely touched his face, but I could see the way his jacket billowed out slightly behind him with each step. He had one hand stuffed deep into his front leather jacket pocket, but it wasn't the hand in the pocket that made me tense up. It was the way he moved, too calm, too collected for someone just out for a walk at 2 a.m. in a place like this. I instinctively reached for my phone in my pocket, but I didn't make a move to call anyone. I knew I had to stay alert, had to make sure I didn't panic. If I did, it would only make things worse. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "What time is it?" I felt a weird shift in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "About 2:10, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You headed somewhere?" He nodded, his face still half hidden in the shadows, but his eyes were locked on me. "Yeah, just out for a walk." "You?" I smiled faintly, my heart pounding a little faster than it should have been. "Just finishing up work. Going home." I hoped my voice didn't betray me, didn't make him think I was nervous. I didn't want him to know how on edge I was. He took a step closer, and that was when I noticed the fidgeting. He kept shifting his stance, rocking on his heels, but most of all, the hand in his jacket pocket never moved. The air seemed to thicken around me as he looked at the car, then back at me. It was a slow, deliberate motion, almost like he was sizing me up, deciding if I was worth the effort. "Nice car," he said after a moment, his eyes flicking toward the vehicle before returning to mine. I nodded, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, she gets me from A to B. It's nothing special." He gave a small nod, then took another step toward me. I took a small step back, instinctively. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but the space between us had shrunk considerably. "Where you headed after this?" His voice was too calm, too casual. I paused, trying to keep the conversation going, keep him talking. "Not sure yet. Probably just grab some food. I'm starving." I forced a light laugh, hoping the sound would make me seem more relaxed than I felt. "I was just thinking I could use some company too, if you're interested. My treat, since I've got a few bucks left." I watched his reaction closely. His face remained neutral, but I saw his eyes flick toward my car again, then back to my face. The silence stretched out, each second feeling like it could go either way. I had no idea what he was thinking, but I knew it didn't feel good. Still, I kept talking, kept offering. "Name's Mary," I added. "What's yours?" His eyes flicked up at me again, and for a second, I thought I saw something in them, something that wasn't quite right. "Nah," he said suddenly. "I'm good." He shifted on his feet, and I saw his hand twitch in his jacket pocket. He didn't move it, but I felt the tension. It was like a trap slowly closing in. "All right," I said, still trying to keep the conversation moving, hoping to buy myself some time. I was done pumping the gas now, and I felt the weight of his presence more than I ever had. The cool night air pressed in, and I could feel my heart racing under the surface. I had made my peace with the situation. If this was how it was going to go down, then so be it. But I also knew this wasn't the way things were supposed to go. I had to keep my wits about me. I couldn't let this man get control of the situation. Not tonight. The silence between us stretched on again, longer this time. He didn't move, didn't say anything. His fidgeting had stopped. For a moment, everything felt impossibly still, as if the world itself had paused. I could hear my own breath in the back of my throat, the faint buzzing of the gas pump behind me. Then, suddenly, he took a step back. And another. His hand came out of his jacket pocket, and for the first time since he walked up to me, I saw both of his hands. His fingers twitched, but the tension that had been hanging in the air, something unspoken but undeniable, was suddenly gone. He gave a tight nod, his lips curling into what I assumed was meant to be a smile. "Nah, I'm just gonna walk. Thanks, though." It was like the air rushed back into my lungs, and I could feel the weight of it, the relief. I kept my eyes on him, didn't turn away, didn't blink. He kept his eyes locked on me as he stepped back, then slowly turned and started walking down the dark road, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long moment after he disappeared into the darkness, still feeling the pulse in my throat, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My fingers were shaking as I grabbed my keys, unlocking the car. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring into the night, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air was still, the silence heavier now that he was gone. My mind raced, but I knew one thing for certain. I had gotten lucky, and I wasn't about to forget it. I didn't know what would have happened if I hadn't made that offer, if I hadn't tried to talk to him, try to make him human, try to break whatever hold he had over me. All I knew was that I didn't want to find out. I made sure the doors were locked before I drove off. I didn't stop until I was safely home. The next day, I went out and bought a taser, just in case. I remember it vividly, though I wish I didn't. A few years back, I was living in Colombo, Sri Lanka, at a small hostel on the outskirts of the city. The place catered to long-term guests, so over time, we all became quite familiar with one another. Among us was Raj, a man whose presence was as enigmatic as his profession. Raj was involved in the casino scene, acting as a middleman for clients who couldn't be there in person. In Sri Lanka, casinos have always operated in a murky legal space. While gambling was prevalent, it wasn't until 2010 that the government passed a bill to regulate it, aiming to boost tourism after years of civil conflict. Despite these regulations, the underbelly of the industry remained rife with corruption, with establishments often exploiting legal loopholes and engaging in bribery to continue operations. Raj's role was to place bets on behalf of Indian clients, allowing them to participate in high-stakes games remotely. He was essentially the bridge between their money and the casino tables. Handling significant sums for influential individuals, his job was fraught with risk. One evening, the atmosphere in the hostel felt off. Raj, usually sociable, was nowhere to be found. Concerned, we checked his room and discovered a hastily written note on his bed. The message was terse. "Don't look for me. I'm leaving." It was uncharacteristic and alarming. Days passed without any word from Raj. We decided to file a missing persons report with the local police. The authorities took our statements and assured us they'd investigate. The waiting was agonizing, each day stretching longer than the last. Then the police returned, requesting someone who knew Raj to accompany them. The local residents were hesitant, fear evident in their eyes. I felt a duty to Raj and volunteered. At the station, they led me to a dimly lit room and presented photographs that turned my stomach. The images depicted a body, dismembered and discarded in a nearby sewer canal. The realization hit hard. It was Raj. The brutality of the act was beyond comprehension. The police informed me that over $50,000 had been stolen from Raj's clients. In the casino world of Colombo, such a loss wasn't just a financial setback, it was a death sentence. The authorities suspected foul play linked to the criminal elements that often lurked in the shadows of the gambling industry. The investigation yielded little. The casino sector in Sri Lanka was notorious for its lack of oversight. Despite attempts to establish regulatory bodies, such as the proposed Gambling Regulatory Authority, progress was slow and enforcement was lax. This regulatory vacuum allowed illicit activities to flourish, making it challenging to trace and apprehend those responsible for crimes like Raj's murder. The images of Raj's fate haunted me. The hostel, once a place of camaraderie, now felt tainted by the tragedy. Unable to shake the memories, I decided to leave, seeking solace and distance from the horrors I'd witnessed. Raj's story serves as a grim reminder of the perils that come with navigating the treacherous waters of an unregulated industry. His life was cut short by the very system he was a part of, a system that, to this day, continues to grapple with corruption and lawlessness. I started working at the theater when I was 20, a few months after dropping out of college. I'd always liked movies, and the theater was one of those big old buildings downtown, the kind that looked like it had been around since the 50s, with tall ceilings and dim hallways, and that faint, constant smell of popcorn and cleaner that never really went away. I worked all kinds of shifts at first, but it wasn't long before I ended up mostly on closings. Fewer people to deal with, quieter halls, a lot of time to yourself. At first, I liked it. The closing crew was usually pretty small, and by the time the last customers were gone and the final trash runs were done, it was just me and one other manager up in the office doing numbers and deposits. This night wasn't any different from the dozens before it. The movies were done, the lobby was empty, and the concession stand was wiped down. It was almost midnight. I was in the office, a cramped little room in the back hallway just past the projector corridors. We had a small CD player in there, one of those old silver ones with chunky buttons, and a plastic bin with CDs we'd collected or brought in over time. It made the last part of the night go by faster, especially when we were stuck counting candy inventory or closing out registers. I was sitting at the small desk next to the safe, squinting at a clipboard with the stock numbers. My co-worker, another manager about my age, was across from me balancing the register and writing out the deposit slip. We weren't really talking, just doing our own thing, the CD player humming some random alternative rock album someone had left behind. After a while, the music started to skip. The CD was scratched, probably from being played too much, so I got up, stepped over to the player, and switched it out with another one from the stack. We kept the CDs in a little pile on the windowsill just behind the desk, right next to the player. Nothing organized, just a stack. I picked one, slid it in, hit play, and sat back down. A minute later, without any warning, the entire stack of CDs launched itself across the room. Not just fell, not slid, they flew. The whole pile seemed to lift and scatter like something had hit them with force from underneath. Some of them clattered against the wall. One of them hit my co-worker square in the back of the head. She flinched hard. I froze. She turned around, saw the CDs all over the office, some under the chair, others near my feet, and looked at me. I was still sitting in the same spot, clipboard in my lap, too stunned to move. Neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other. She stood up, rubbed the back of her head, and slowly started picking up the CDs. I joined her. We didn't say much, just finished our work as quickly as we could, turned off the lights, and locked the place up. On the drive home, I kept thinking about it, trying to figure out what had happened. There was no one else in the office. Nothing had fallen on the pile, and it wasn't near the edge. The window wasn't open. Hell, the window didn't even open. It was sealed tight and caked with grime on the outside. There wasn't any air vent nearby, and even if there had been a draft, it wouldn't have launched them. They'd gone flying with enough force to scatter across the entire room. One had hit her hard enough to sting. I went over it in my head again and again, but came up with nothing that made sense. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not right away. I figured maybe we were tired. Maybe it wasn't as dramatic as it seemed. Maybe the stack had just fallen and bounced weird. But that's not what it felt like. That's not what I saw. A couple days later, I got a call from one of the other managers. She was usually on the day shift, so we didn't work together often, but we were friendly. She called me in the late morning, sounding irritated. I used to have a buddy who lived a few streets over in our quiet neighborhood. We often spent evenings together, unwinding in his backyard with a couple of beers and a deck of cards. One particular night was no different. We laughed, played cards, and enjoyed the cool breeze that rustled through the trees. As the evening wore on, I realized it was nearing 10 o'clock, and I had some errands to run the next morning. I said my goodbyes, thanked him for the evening, and began the short walk home. The walk was familiar and uneventful. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and the occasional chirp of crickets filled the air. I took my time, enjoying the tranquility of the night. As I approached my house, I noticed my roommate stepping out the front door, coffee in hand, dressed for work. He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "I thought you were asleep," he said, glancing at my truck parked in the driveway. I was confused. I had just left my friend's house. It couldn't have been more than a 15-minute walk. Why was he heading to work now? "It's just after 5 in the morning," he added, noticing my bewildered expression. I pulled out my phone, and sure enough, it was 5:07 a.m. I was stunned. I had left my friend's house at 10 the previous evening. Where had the time gone? My roommate left for work, leaving me standing there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I paced around the living room, my mind racing. I called my friend, who groggily confirmed that I had left his place at 10 the night before. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. I wasn't drunk, I had only had 2 beers. I wasn't tired, and I had no known medical conditions that would cause me to black out. There was no logical explanation for the missing 7 hours. I felt a chill run down my spine. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I retraced my steps, trying to recall any detail that might explain the lost time. I spoke to neighbors, checked security cameras, but found nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if those 7 hours had simply vanished. I began to research possible explanations. I came across terms like dissociative amnesia and time blindness, conditions that could cause a person to lose track of time or even forget entire periods. But I had no history of trauma or mental illness. I wasn't under any significant stress. The more I read, the more questions I had. I considered the possibility of a medical condition. Could I have had a seizure? I visited a doctor, underwent tests, but everything came back normal. There was no evidence of any neurological issues. I was healthy. As time passed, the incident became a lingering mystery in my life. I never experienced anything like it again, but the memory of that night, the lost time, stayed with me. It was a reminder that not everything in life can be explained. Sometimes we have to accept the unknown. Years later, I still think about that night. I still wonder what happened during those 7 hours. But I've come to terms with the fact that I may never know. And perhaps that's okay. I remember that night in 2011 vividly. The snowstorm was relentless, blanketing everything in a thick white veil. I was driving down an old highway that had seen better days. Its usage dwindled over the years. My girlfriend at the time was with me, and we were heading to the next town over. The road was treacherous, with snow piling up rapidly, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. We had been following an SUV for a while, its taillights our guiding beacons through the storm. Suddenly, the SUV came to a halt. I carefully maneuvered around it to see what had caused the stop. In front of us was a truck, its driver and passenger doors wide open. 2 sets of footprints led from the truck into the dense woods beside the road. Concerned, I stepped out of the car to check if anyone needed help. The truck didn't show any signs of mechanical issues, and there wasn't much snow inside, indicating the doors hadn't been open for long. I considered following the footprints into the woods, but hesitated. Before I could make a decision, the driver of the SUV called out to me, informing me that the truck had been reported stolen and that highway patrol was on their way. Taking this into account, I decided to continue on our journey. A day or so later, I learned that the owner of the truck was a local man who had been missing for over a week. The police searched the woods and found his body in a ditch, freshly deceased with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. It appeared that whoever had taken him had marched him into the woods, executed him, and disappeared into the night. Reflecting on that night, I'm profoundly grateful I didn't follow those tracks. We hadn't heard a gunshot, suggesting the execution occurred just moments before we arrived. The thought of what could have happened if I'd ventured into the woods haunts me to this day. The sun was setting behind the peaks as I sped west on I-70 through Colorado, headed toward Utah. I'd been driving for hours already, trying to make it across the state before it got too dark. It wasn't exactly a lonely road, not in the normal sense, but once you get into those deep canyons like Glenwood Canyon, the road hugs the river so tightly and curves so often that it feels like you're the only one out there. The walls of rock rise straight up on both sides, and even though it's technically a highway, there are long stretches where it feels completely isolated. Cell service is spotty, and you can go miles without seeing an exit, a gas station, or even another car. I had been going a little too fast, if I'm honest. I'd been pushing the speed limit the whole day, riding that fine line between saving time and risking a ticket. There's something about the open road, the way the car hums beneath you, the rhythm of the tires rolling over pavement. It's easy to get into a zone. But as the canyon narrowed and the scenery started to shift into those beautiful, jagged rock faces, I decided to ease up. I let off the gas a little and let the cruise control do the rest. The sun filtered through the canyon at an angle that painted the rocks golden, and the river beside the highway flashed silver between the trees. I rolled the windows down and let the cool canyon air in. It smelled like water and stone and pine. It felt good. I came around a bend and saw a state patrol SUV in the right lane about a quarter mile ahead of me. My stomach dropped for a second. Instinct. I hadn't seen him before, and for all I knew he'd been watching me speed through the last few miles. I eased into the left lane and took my foot off the gas. I kept a steady pace, trying not to look guilty. My eyes flicked to my rear view, then back to the road. A few seconds later, the trooper turned on his lights. My heart skipped a beat. I thought for sure he had me. I watched closely as his SUV pulled slowly toward the shoulder. But instead of signaling for me to pull over, he drifted to a stop behind a car that had already pulled off to the side. A small sedan, silver or gray maybe. The kind of car you'd see anywhere and not think twice about. It had its hazards on, and the driver's door was cracked open. As I passed, I turned my head just enough to look and saw someone in the driver's seat, head down, hands maybe on the wheel. It looked like they were slumped over, like they were either asleep or on their phone. At the time I thought, man, that guy's lucky someone showed up. Out here, no cell coverage, that could have been bad. I didn't think much more of it. Just a stranded motorist getting help. I kept driving west. The canyon went on for a while, and traffic was light. Maybe a car or two every few minutes, but otherwise it was just me, the road, and the cliffs. I turned the music back on, something mellow, and tried to enjoy the last bit of daylight before the sun dipped completely out of view. About 10 minutes later, still cruising along through the canyon, I started to notice flashing lights in my mirror. A pair of headlights weaving through traffic fast. I figured it was another cop, or maybe someone in a real hurry. But as it got closer, I realized it was another state patrol SUV, sirens on full blast. It blew past me in the left lane, like I was standing still. The driver barely touched the brakes around the curves. I watched it disappear around the bend ahead, red and blue lights dancing across the canyon walls. Then another one came, and another. Within minutes, I'd counted 5 or 6 patrol cars screaming back east, the direction I'd just come from. They weren't spaced out either. They were right behind each other, all moving like it was life or death. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, not because I was scared exactly, but because something felt wrong. You don't see that kind of response for a flat tire or a traffic stop gone long. This was different. The road straightened out for a while, and I could see way down the highway. More lights, a whole line of them. Police, fire, EMTs. I counted at least a dozen vehicles racing back into the canyon, sirens echoing off the rock walls like thunder. The sound bounced around in strange ways, made it hard to tell where they were coming from. Some of the ambulances had their back doors open, like they were prepping to receive someone on the fly. I slowed down even more. I didn't want to be part of whatever was going on back there. It looked serious. The traffic going west was still light, but you could feel it now. Something had happened. That kind of urgency doesn't come from nothing. By the time I got through the canyon and started heading into flatter terrain, the light was nearly gone. The sun had dipped completely behind the mountains, and the sky had turned a deep blue-gray. I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling. I didn't know what I'd just passed, or if I'd somehow driven by it without realizing, but it stuck with me the rest of the way to my hotel. Every time I looked in the rear view, I expected to see more lights, more sirens. But eventually the road went quiet again. Just long stretches of darkness and the hum of the car. I made it to a hotel just across the border in Utah that night. It wasn't fancy, just a roadside chain off the highway. I checked in, dropped my bag on the bed, and turned on the TV more out of habit than anything else. I didn't even bother changing the channel at first. It was on the local news, the sound turned down low. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to get my maps to load properly, when something on the TV caught my eye. The news station was showing footage of Glenwood Canyon. I saw the stretch of road I'd driven that evening. The same curves, the same stone walls. I grabbed the remote and turned the volume up. The reporter was standing near the edge of the highway with emergency vehicles lined up behind her. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read something like, "Trooper injured in canyon shooting, suspect dead." I sat there, completely still, as the pieces started to click together. Apparently, not long after I passed, that trooper pulled off to help the broken-down car. Everything went to hell. The motorist hadn't broken down at all. He'd parked there on purpose. The story was still developing, but they'd already released some details. The man in the car had skipped bail a few months earlier on charges that were serious enough to put him away for years. The trooper had pulled over thinking it was a routine assist, a guy with car trouble in a no-cell zone. When he approached the car, the motorist opened the door and shot him. Multiple times in the back. No warning, no chance to react. Just pulled the trigger and kept pulling. Normally, the trooper would have been alone. Most of the time, they patrol solo, especially in those remote areas. But that day, by pure coincidence or luck, or whatever you want to call it, he wasn't. He was headed to a training and had a second officer in the car with him. That officer had been getting paperwork together when he heard the shots. He got out and returned fire, hitting the suspect and killing him on the spot. The first trooper collapsed near the shoulder of the road. He was losing blood fast. The second officer called in the shooting, started first aid, and tried to stop the bleeding. That's when all the backup started pouring in. They brought in helicopters, EMTs, everyone within range. It was all hands on deck. The trooper was flown out by airlift and taken into surgery. The news said he was in critical condition, but had made it through the night. They thought he was going to live. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the screen. The footage played over and over again. The same spot on the highway. The same stretch I'd passed less than an hour before the shots rang out. I thought about the man in the car, head down, not moving. I thought about how close I'd been to all of it. Just a few minutes either way, and I might have seen it happen. Or worse, I couldn't stop thinking about that trooper. Just doing his job, pulling over to help someone on the side of the road. How many times had he done that before? Dozens, hundreds, and this time, it nearly killed him. If his partner hadn't been there, he'd probably be dead. Shot in the back, alone, bleeding out beside a canyon wall. The news didn't say the suspect's name that night. They only described him as a fugitive with a long record, someone who'd been running for a while. I found out more the next morning, reading through different news sites while eating breakfast in the hotel lobby. He'd been wanted in another state for armed robbery and assault. He was due in court weeks earlier and never showed. They'd been looking for him ever since. It haunted me, knowing that I passed right by it. That in some twisted way, I'd been a thread in that story. Just a random traveler on the highway, unaware that a man with a gun was about to pull one of the most violent acts you can imagine. The rest of the drive felt different after that. I kept watching the road, kept checking my mirrors. Every time I saw a car on the shoulder, I felt a chill. You think you're out in the middle of nowhere, safe in your car, moving too fast for trouble to find you. But the truth is, the line between ordinary and chaos is thin. Paper thin. 1 second you're admiring the view through a canyon. The next, the road behind you is full of sirens and flashing lights, and someone's fighting for their life. When I got back home a few days later, I checked the news again. The trooper had pulled through surgery and was awake. His department released a statement. They said he was stable, talking, and expected to make a full recovery after months of rehab. They said he'd been wearing a vest, but one of the rounds missed it. The partner who returned fire was being called a hero. They gave a timeline of the events, down to the minute. I read every word. It's strange how those moments stay with you. I wasn't part of it, not really. I didn't know the officer. I didn't hear the gunshots. I didn't even see the second cop in the car. But I was there, just ahead of it, close enough to feel the ripple of it behind me. Sometimes when I think back on it, I remember the face of the man in the car. Not a clear image, just that vague. When we first moved out here, it felt like the kind of place people imagine when they think of peace and quiet. Long stretches of road lined with trees, so thick on either side it felt like driving through a tunnel. The fields seemed to roll on forever. Cows in the distance. Crickets humming at dusk. Not a whole lot of streetlights. Not a whole lot of traffic either. It was exactly what we had wanted, a slower pace, more space, less noise. The house sat far back from the road, surrounded by woods and a wide gravel driveway that crunched under the tires whenever we pulled in or out. It had an old barn on the property too, one that had seen better days, but still stood strong. We bought the place in early spring, and the air had that faint smell of thawed earth and blooming things, a damp, earthy scent that I can still remember. The first few weeks were all about settling in, painting walls, figuring out which light switch controlled what, discovering how unreliable the water pressure could be when someone was doing laundry and showering at the same time. The kind of small-town quirks people don't tell you about, but you figure out quickly. We liked it here. Quiet enough to sleep with the windows open, peaceful enough that you'd wake up to the sound of birds or the occasional squirrel scurrying across the roof. But not long after we moved in, I started noticing something strange. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little things that didn't add up. I'd leave the house at exactly 7 a.m. every morning to get to work by 8. The route was easy. Take the main road from our driveway to the highway, then follow it straight into town. On a good day, it was a 20-minute drive. With traffic, maybe 30 at most. I'd been doing the same route every day, same time, same pace. But sometimes, even after I left on time, I'd pull into the office parking lot, and it would be 8 o'clock exactly, or just a minute shy of it. At first, I thought maybe I had left a little later than I meant to. Maybe I got held up at a stop sign or slowed behind a school bus. But it didn't feel like that. There were no obvious delays, just a weird stretch of time that I couldn't fully account for. It bothered me, not enough to raise alarm bells, but enough to keep nagging at the back of my mind. So I started keeping better track. My husband kept a maintenance log in the center console of the car, mostly for oil changes, tire pressure, little reminders. I started using it to write down the exact time I left the house. I'd jot it down, drive like normal, and note the time again when I hit the highway entrance. That stretch from our driveway to the highway was barely over 2 miles. It should have taken about 5 minutes, maybe a few more if I drove slower. But that's where it got weird. Some days, I'd hit the highway in 5 or 6 minutes, no problem. Other days, I'd glance at the clock and it would be nearly 7:25. A full 20, sometimes 25 minutes had passed, just to cover a 2-mile stretch of country road. And there wasn't any reason for it. No accidents, no traffic, not even a train crossing. Just gone. That time was just missing. And the road didn't change. Still lined with trees, still no stoplights, still a 45 miles per hour speed limit that most people ignored anyway. It didn't happen every day. Maybe once or twice a week, no consistent pattern. That made it harder to explain. I even tried changing my routine slightly, leaving a few minutes earlier or later, switching the radio off to see if it helped me focus. But it didn't change anything. Some days, it was a normal commute. Other days, time slipped. Not all of it, just a piece. Always that same stretch of road. Always between home and the highway. I told my husband about it. He worked night shifts at the time, commuting home around 3:30 in the morning. At first, he dismissed it gently, said I must be zoning out, losing track of time, maybe just tired in the mornings. But a couple weeks later, he started mentioning something similar. He'd call me sometimes on his way home just to stay awake, especially when he was feeling drowsy. I'd be half asleep, listening to him talk about how dead the roads were, how the stars looked so sharp in the sky. But now and then, he'd get home and realize it was nearly 4:45, when it should have only taken 45 minutes tops. He started watching the clock more carefully too. Same pattern. Some nights were fine. Others, it felt like he lost time, and it always seemed to be in the same area, right before the turnoff to our road, where the trees thickened and the road curved slightly uphill. There was never any fog, never any road construction, just that strange stretch of country road that somehow chewed up time like it didn't want to give it back. Eventually, we both started using a longer route to get to the highway. It added maybe 5 minutes to the drive, winding us around a neighboring area, past an old school and some wide-open fields. A little more out of the way, but we figured it was better than dealing with whatever was happening on that other stretch. The lost time stopped, completely. As long as we avoided that route, our commutes were normal again. It felt like a relief, even though we didn't understand it. The longer route became our new normal. We stuck to that for a while, months, maybe a year. And as time passed, life got busier. More neighbors moved in. New houses popped up where there used to be nothing but trees. The woods along the main road got cut down, first for a housing development, then for a shopping center. Roads that were once quiet and shaded became clogged with traffic and noise. Streetlights were installed. Stop signs showed up at old intersections. The character of the place changed slowly but steadily. Eventually, we drifted back to using the original road again, the one that had once swallowed up our time. It didn't feel eerie anymore. It felt ordinary, sometimes even frustrating with how backed up it could get. There were school buses and speed bumps and police patrols now. The woods that had once made the road feel enclosed were mostly gone, replaced by sidewalks and landscaping and fresh asphalt. Whatever strange thing had happened to us back then didn't happen anymore. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of it all. Because I think back to those early years, how quiet that road used to be, how undisturbed the woods felt. There were no cameras, no GPS trackers, nothing watching or recording anything. Just a 2-mile road under a ceiling of trees, hushed and dark even in the mornings. It felt like we were the only ones using it sometimes. I wonder if we were wrong to think of it as just a road. Maybe there was something else happening on that stretch back then, something not dramatic or dangerous, just off. Something that required that quiet, that seclusion, something that didn't like to be seen. But nothing ever happened to us, not really. We didn't crash, we weren't attacked. There were no strange markings on the car, no signs of tampering. Just a chunk of time that vanished every now and then, with no explanation. It stopped as soon as we stopped using that road. And it never came back, even when we returned to it later, after everything had changed. The thing that gets me, though, is how complete the change was. The road isn't recognizable anymore. The trees that formed that tunnel of branches are gone. They were bulldozed down to make room for development. It's bright now, exposed, full of cars and noise and signs. Whatever that feeling was, the sense of something just out of sight, the sensation that time didn't flow quite right there, it's gone. We can't even point to where it happened anymore. The landmarks are gone. The curve of the road has been softened, straightened in some places. There's even a gas station now, right where the woods used to begin. It's like that part of our lives was sealed off when the land was changed. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe something was tied to that place the way it was. Not haunted or magical, nothing like that. Just peculiar, subtle, the way some places are. We think we understand space and time like they're simple things. But maybe they're not. Maybe some places have a strange relationship with them. And when you build over them, level the ground and pave new roads, you erase that relationship completely. Sometimes I think back to those drives and wonder what happened in that lost time. Nothing ever seemed out of place when I came to. The car was still moving, still aimed down the road. No dents, no strange smells or signs. I was just further along than I thought I should be. Same with my husband. We didn't feel drugged or confused, just slightly disoriented. The way you feel when you wake up and the clock says it's later than you expected. But when I remember it now, it feels distant. Not like something that happened to us, but more like something we read about or saw on TV. Time smooths things over, makes the edges blurry. If I didn't have those entries in the maintenance log, I might even doubt it ever happened. I flipped back through that log once a few years ago when we were cleaning out the car. I saw my handwriting, neat and careful. Left house, 7 o'clock. Highway entrance, 7:25. I'd done it a few times. Enough to know it wasn't just one fluke. We don't talk about it much anymore. Life moves on. We've got different worries now. The commute really does take 25 minutes just to get to the highway most mornings. But that's traffic, stoplights, real-world delays. There's nothing strange about it anymore. Everything adds up now. Still, every now and then, when I take that road early in the morning, if the traffic is light and the sky is just starting to brighten, I glance at the dashboard clock a little more often than usual. I keep track of how long it takes. I try not to let my mind drift. And sometimes, just for a split second, I swear I feel that old sensation again. The one that tells me I'm not alone in the car. That something is watching. Not with malice. Just watching. But then the road curves past the new elementary school. A stoplight turns green. A kid on a bike crosses the sidewalk, and the spell breaks.